Good morning and welcome to the second meeting of 2026 of Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have apologies this morning from Paul O'Kane. Our only public agenda item this morning is our first evidence session on our inquiry into neurodivergence in Scotland. This inquiry was precipitated by the Scottish Government's decision in 2024 to delay the introduction of a Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill. In this inquiry, we will be focusing on the experiences of neurodivergent people in education, employment and the criminal justice system. We will hear this morning from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and then we will move into a roundtable format to explore the key themes of this inquiry with autistic disabled people's organisations and an ADHD organisation. We begin with the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and I would like to welcome to our meeting Dr Jim Crabb, Policy Lead, Royal College of Psychiatrists in Scotland, Dr Leonie Boeing, CAMS Psychiatrist and Vice Chair of the Child and Adolescent Faculty, Royal College of Psychiatrists in Scotland. You're both very welcome this morning. Thank you for attending. I refer members to papers 1 and 2, and we'll begin to ask some questions. I'm going to kick us off this morning, and I'll come to you first, Dr Crabb. Would you be able to summarise the background of this report and any key points within it, please?
I'll be glad to. Thank you so much for allowing us to come this morning to give evidence on this issue, which is probably one of the widest and most pressing that Scotland's facing just now. I'm a general adult psychiatrist, so I work with people from 18 to 65, and I've also been the lead clinician for autism in NHS Forth Valley. I've also, before becoming policy lead for the Royal College of Psychiatrists, I was an associate medical director, so I was responsible for running and managing and maintaining mental health services in a part of Scotland that's fairly representative, Forth Valley, so we have real pockets of urban deprivation right through to people in very rural communities as well. So that's allowed me personally to become aware of this issue. And I think it's important to start to say the scale of the need that's been uncovered over the last 10 years really is unprecedented, and it was unpredicted. It's probably worth also as well noting that Scotland is not unique. Every economically developed country in the world is facing the same needs. So no country predicted this need, no country prepared for it well, and no country is particularly managing this need well just now. So we don't think there's any value pointing fingers saying, you know, whose fault is this? We are where we are. But the really positive thing is today that we've got the opportunity in Scotland to think about this differently, and we can really show the world how we can build a society and a system that can provide kind, compassionate and meaningful support to people who are neurodivergent.
Okay. Thank you. Dr Boeing, would you like to come in?
Yes, hi there. And again, I echo the thanks for convening this meeting and giving us so much time to present our evidence. So, and just as a bit of background, I've been a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist for about 20 years this year, so it's my big celebrated year. And I've been a neurodevelopmental specialist for about 8 years now. And I'm lead psychiatrist for Borders CAMS, but here on behalf of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. So, and I'm bringing together our neurodevelopmental pathways recommendations for under 18s, and I also sit on the neurodevelopmental task force for children and young people as well, which is a Scottish Government convened, but has representatives from across a full range of professional groups and organisations bringing together to see how to bring the direction forward and develop things from the neurodevelopmental specification that was published a few years back. And certainly from, I echo Jim's points and things, and for under 18s, there's been a unprecedented rise in referrals to child and adolescent mental health services across the world. Mapping it within the UK, it's really been the last 20 years. So it's definitely a pre-COVID thing. And if anything, the only point at which COVID affected referrals was that they actually went down a bit in 2020 when people were struggling to be seen. So, so many multifactorial reasons for why the demand has gone up so much, and so I'm happy to speak to that in more detail if that's one of the later questions and things, but echoing the sense that this isn't anybody's fault, it wasn't foreseen, and in many ways it feels like the world's sort of slightly tilted on its axis a wee bit, and that has made it a less child-friendly environment in many, many ways. And children's mental health is, I've always seen it as a barometer for how the world is and the health of the world. You know, so when kids are presenting in mental health distress, whatever shape or form that might be in, that's a sense that the societies in the world isn't doing all that well. The children's mental health is like the canary in the coal mine. So.
Yeah, thank you. We're now going to move on to other questions from our members. And Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much, and good morning both. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the detail in the report. I'm interested in a couple of different areas, and I suppose I want to think about diagnosis and the value of diagnosis for people. Given that we've heard there's evidence that shows quite clearly that having some kind of diagnosis, whether it's autism, whether it's ADHD, some kind of neurodivergent divergent diagnosis, gives people something from which to work and is validating, and then gives them something that they can explain to people. I suppose two questions from that. How can we make sure that people without a diagnosis are still supported? And given the long wait times for any kind of medical assessment, some people are waiting years for diagnosis. How I know those are two quite different questions, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on how we deal with that question of validation through diagnosis.
Let's go for it. Thank you. This is a huge area, and we think it's an area where there's not an either or.
Okay.
It's an and. And I think that's one of the challenges. Often we're taught, particularly in the UK, to think very binary, that there's a single right or wrong way of doing something. And actually, diagnosis can be incredibly powerful and validating and life-saving for some people. But on the other hand, it takes 4 or 5 hours to do a proper assessment, and there are real risks with misdiagnosis or overdiagnosis of a condition. And there's a huge number of people who have the traits of neurodiversity but don't meet the full diagnostic criteria, who also need help and support. And I might, if it's helpful, I might almost give 2 examples from my practice about to sort of illustrate this. When I was working in an autism service, people would be waiting 5 or 6 years to see me to have the assessment. And sometimes for a large number of people, the help and support and the advice that they needed was the same whether they had a formal diagnosis of autism or neurodivergency as if they had traits. And the tragedy was that people had been left for 4, 5, 6 years because nobody wanted to make things worse. So GPs didn't want to say, well, it might be autism, we don't want to make this worse, we don't know much about it. Primary care mental health nurses would leave them alone. Schools, teachers, everyone would withdraw because they didn't know what was going on. And actually what that person needed was advice about sleep, screen time, exercise, caffeine. They needed some coaching about how to manage lifestyle factors, how to manage busy environments, and how to feel more confident in social interactions. And that was often the same package of interventions I would give to somebody who had autism or who had traits. And the tragedies that that person had waited 4 to 5 years to see me, to be told that advice. And then often I wouldn't have the time to really follow them up and to make sure, to see how that advice was going. So that's one situation where actually we clearly need to make sure that people get the help and the families get the help into their hands years before they get stuck enough to see a clinician like me. Another example from my practice would be at the other end of the spectrum, where I saw a gentleman in his 50s who had lived with his mother. He'd managed to maintain a part-time job, but he needed his mother to help him get dressed and prepared for the day and to help him with most of the activities outside of his part-time job. And she was now in her 80s. Her health was failing, and she said, I won't be able to support my son any longer. He won't be able to live independently. And she was desperately worried about what was going to happen to him. So the diagnosis of autism in that case meant it opened up care packages from social work, so that actually that man and that family could rest easy knowing that actually he was going to be able to live long-term in the community independently. So it is this situation where actually, for some people, diagnosis is absolutely essential, but if we're thinking about a need that's going to meet 10 to 20% of the population, we are thinking along the same lines as conditions such as obesity, where actually I think most people can understand and accept that you will need specialist surgeons and doctors to help the people with the most severe forms, the most complex forms of obesity. But there needs to be a whole suite of interventions right across society, because an awful lot of people won't need to see those specialist doctors, just can't.
Can I just pick up on that second example you give? And I can see quite clearly the diagnosis was essential to opening up care packages. Is there a question, and I'm not trying to downplay the importance of diagnosis at all, but is there a question that the assessment of need for the care package shouldn't have to depend on a diagnosis? And maybe because of straitened times, because of limited resources, that's what gets the people to the top of the pile, as it were. But is there something that we could be doing differently, taking a whole system approach here that doesn't rely on that diagnosis to get somebody the right care they need?
Absolutely. And this is something that we have recommended as one of our 10 pillars of work that need to be taken across society, that actually there should be a needs-based approach for support, whether that's in schools, in educational settings, colleges, universities, whether that's in the workplace or whether that's in the welfare system and in the criminal justice system, where actually if people need support, that should be made available. Because often what makes the difference between somebody progressing in life or becoming stuck and disabled is often very straightforward practical adjustments. And you shouldn't have to wait 4 or 5 years, and you shouldn't have to undergo a 4 or 5 hour assessment to open those things up.
Luni, did you want to come in on?
Yeah, and it's one of these sort of fascinating questions, and people have very different feelings about it as well, and things. And I think we have to be sensitive to if this is what an individual person wants or needs, because it's all part of their story and their identity, and so it's not something for us to ordain somebody with, a diagnosis. It should be a collaborative process. That's a shared decision. And things that should be part of a story that we create together as we listen and we inquire and things. So I suppose I'd want to have that at the heart of the process. But the reality is, with the way things have been, where it's been very process-driven and, bottlenecks for diagnosis, there's absolutely no way we are going to be able to diagnose ourselves out of the current waiting list. For example, we've got over 40,000 children waiting for some form of neurodevelopmental assessment at the moment. And that, I suspect, that's just the tip of the iceberg, given the under-recording and data collection systems and things. So I think I think it's more important that children have their needs met when they have the need, and that will change over time, because by definition, children change as they grow and develop. The expectations of them change and grow and develop over time, and how they're much more sensitive to what other people round about them are doing. They're completely dependent on their carers. We obligate them to go to school or access education and things, so their lives are different. And I think it's. I want to give an example of a kid who's maybe got a communication disorder, so issues with language understanding, that actually is such a crucial interface with the world, that if that's not understood early, people will keep talking at that kid, and expect them to answer, and the kid will become more and more stressed and overwhelmed, So it's crucial that that's really understood, and there's some recognition of it, and they see the person with the really specialist expertise to help the kid and the people round about them understand. So the communication round about them is adapted to help that kid be, cope and enjoy and thrive in their environment and things. So if the children can access that kind of understanding as they go along, and that will translate in through key transitions through, nursery, primary school, high school and college, that if their sort of profile, their neurotype is understood, then actually people round about them get them, and life will go better. And the more they can thrive and grow as they develop, and whether or not at some point that will lead to, so the two big diagnoses we talk about a lot are an autism diagnosis or an ADHD diagnosis, but there's lots and lots of different neurodevelopmental conditions and profiles and things. It's just more that we have a good understanding of the child, and actually if a child has had that recognition and their needs met as they go along, young, then when it comes to whatever point in their life a diagnostic assessment might be helpful, if they've been understood as they go, yeah, hopefully they're not suffering the sequelae of not being understood, so not, they're making it into school with adaptations. People know to use visuals instead of tons of words and things like that. Actually, for the people who might do the diagnostic assessment, it's much easier. It takes much less time. So we would advocate for sort of pathways for assessment they sort of build on themselves. So sometimes you might be able to do quite an abbreviated, quite a quick diagnostic assessment, just sort of confirming what everybody knows, yeah, who really, really knows the kids. And I would have the families right at the heart of this as well. Sometimes it is undoubtedly incredibly complicated, yeah. I'm all dazzled every day by the complexity of some of the children that I work with, but so there is a place for detailed, complex and ongoing assessments as we sort of try to understand sort of some children and things. But it's so it's a process. But I would see we need to reserve, make sure they get what they need as they go, because it will change over time.
Thanks both. That's helpful. And I suppose you've both talked about meeting needs when they arise. And I wonder if you've got any suggestions about, given the long waiting lists and the significant amount of time that some people, children go onto the waiting list as teenagers and will be in their mid-20s if current times are, sustained and no longer eligible for that service. So what are the short, medium and longer term steps that we need to be considering? And I suppose just a little add-on to that, given that looking at a needs-based and a whole person approach, whole family approach, needing to break down some of the departmental barriers and silos that exist, and how do you see the work that we are doing around this table over the next few weeks supporting that? Sorry, that was a big question, but
yeah.
I think that this is absolutely consistent with the pillars of work we've recommended in our multi-system report that was published in October. As you've pointed out, we cannot keep doing what we're doing. That is the definition of insanity, isn't it? Is expecting that something is going to be different, or we find a ring-fenced piece of money, we do a waiting list initiative, we invest in more assessments, we do more pilot projects. Absolutely, in the next 12 months, we need to move to delivering these pillars of work that we've recommended. And they are across society. So as you highlighted, it is about saying, what are reasonable adjustments in schools, colleges, universities? What are reasonable adjustments in workplaces that employers can provide? If somebody feels they need these, they should be provided. And it's remarkable in my practice, when you're able to speak to tutors at colleges or teachers at school or employers with people's permission, actually they go, well, of course, I would have done that ages ago if I'd known that was going to be helpful. That's not a big deal. And it's just about having a really clear advice across society about here's reasonable adjustments. And actually they will be helpful whether you have a formal diagnosis or traits, or even actually if you're not neurodivergent, there may be a benefit to a child or your own person for a school being able to offer things like a movement break. So it is about, we would ask that this committee use its influence to make sure that there's a cross-governmental approach, because this is way bigger than health and social care. We need to have clear guidance across the benefit system, across the criminal justice system, across the workplace, and across the educational systems about what are reasonable adjustments that should be provided for people in practical terms, so there's no delay, those things can be put in place, and people don't get stuck, they can keep moving in their lives. The second thing then is about actually having really clear evidence-based advice for public and family members, again, so that people don't get stuck waiting for somebody like us to tell them what might be helpful. We need things like NHS Inform to have really clear evidence-based guidelines available to the public. People need to know where they are. It needs to inform the whole system, from health visitors, giving advice about things like screen time, exercise, caffeine, sleep, right through the life course, so people actually start to work through the things that can make neurodiversity more problematic. for a person. And then we need to commission at scale on a once for Scotland basis initial self-help and peer support groups for people. So there's really good models. We've had so many pilots across Scotland that show that you can have a range of approaches, but usually they involve coaching, peer support that can be run by our partners in the third sector, that people can access whether they have a diagnosis or not, and they can dip in and dip out that support depending on what's happening in their life. And those things would be the bottom tiers that really society needs to move to a better place.
Thanks very much, Jim. Leonie, do you have anything to add to?
Yes, I mean, just adapting it for kids. I mean, the context is school and education, you know, and things, and I suppose. And I suppose trying to mobilise the third sector. I've never met a more passionate and more motivated, well-informed group of people than parents of kids who are neurodivergent. Absolutely, they're an army, yeah, and incredibly knowledgeable, and you know, so actually sort of mobilising that through the third sector, through community hubs, through family support models. You know, there have been many pilots across Scotland as in sort of as a sequelae to the neurodevelopmental specification for children's services and things, and problems with the implementation because it kind of got stuck within health. But now the ND task force is designed in order to bring that forward. But I think that sort of cross-governmental approach is really, really important. It kind of feels like things get stuck in a silo across government. So given that the energy and the passion that there is for this, you know, this wicked problem that we have as a society and a world kind of thing, to actually sort of, it needs something within government that transcends the silos so that the funding doesn't get stuck, so expertise doesn't get lost and things. So I wonder, you know, from your committee, sort of really utilising the approach of human rights in the UNCRC. I mean, what a lot of energy went into getting that into statute, and yet actually how do we mobilise that to turn into a meaningful thing? You know, I've never seen anything that might be more effective for improving access, for example, learning disabled, intellectually disabled children and things. You know, they have the highest level of need for mental and physical health, and you know, appalling mortality gap. For, you know, and the parents are stuck at home and unable to get out and advocate for what their children need and things. So the access and equality issues are just horrendous for that. You know, there's a sort of an extreme example and things, and you know, and I think UNCRC, where that's really clear that should not be a barrier to access to services. So I would really hope that this committee can mobilise that as clear messaging for everybody's got to get their act together and work together.
Thanks. May I come in just on that point about access? And it is about quality. It's about quality of access, and this is why we need, you know, central commissioning in this area, because currently just now the landscape is so fragmented. You know, we have over 32 different parts of the healthcare system, all of whom commission different things locally depending on their need. And my own experience of having led one of these services is obviously you have your own pressures within that system that you spend the money on. And of course, the result for the public is that you have this postcode lottery that you go from 10 miles down the road in Scotland, and you get a very different experience. You might get a great third sector support service that's being commissioned because that health part of the system's found the money, is able to do it for a year or two, but then it gets closed down because there's other pressures that have come along, because each bit of the system is competing with each other in a really fiendishly complex system. And there needs to be that clarity that actually this is important. This is what 10 to 20% of the population of Scotland need. These are services that are evidence-based. This is how it's going to be run. There's really clear standards and accountability and governance around those services, and they provide results. And they're accessible whether you live in the Orkney Islands or you live in the central belt of Scotland.
And I think it needs to be, because one size will not fit all for every area. Yeah, if you look at the workforce issues, you know, some areas have no child and adolescent psychiatrists at all. Others have more psychologists. It's, you know, it's very variable. So I think the sort of principles need to be the skills that people need to be doing that kind of work. And if they can't access it locally, they can access it regionally or subnationally, and things to make the specialist expertise accessible to all. But I think on the most important things that will make the biggest difference are for children every day. that actually when they're at school that they have, to improve the universal offer. If we're in a position where 43% of children have some sort of additional support need, something isn't right. And things, and it's great that that's being recognised, but that's a sign that the universal offer isn't okay and things. And even just as a small example, I don't know how many times I've seen young people, and for example, I know them for years because I might be overseeing their ADHD treatment. And actually from one year to the next, what the communication style is, whether the teacher gets them, whether they have a quiet place to go. The level of noise is extraordinary in the world, And actually, if you're a kid who's more finely tuned, that's going to impact you more, So, it just seems ridiculous that somebody who's as specialist as me has over 20 years been having exactly the same conversations in school meetings about actually just need a quiet place to go. And the schools are built open plan. Every square inch of space is allocated to something that involves a lot of noise. So it's, in outdoor spaces that children are welcome to play in, because the crucial thing for all of us, we know, because we're all here, doing our best, and we get a sense of self-worth by thinking we can make a difference. And I'm sure that's what's motivated you all to going into politics, and that's what's motivating us to do our work with the college and when we work every day as doctors, and and everybody's involved in this game, and things. And it's the same for kids and adults when they're growing up. They need a meaningful sense of purpose in the world, and that'll look different for different people. So right from the get-go, when children start playing and then where they're learning through play and all of these things. So we need to be sort of thinking about what do humans need to grow and thrive, and that'll look really different for different people, But that's what will make the biggest difference, is that we really enjoy and nurture people's differences.
Both. I think that's been a really helpful sort of foundation for the rest of our inquiry, and at that point of inclusion is actually good for everybody. Diagnosis, not condition or not. And I think that's something that we need to hold on to. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a supplementary on a question from Paul before we move on to
just on that point, because I think you're right. I met with you guys and talked about this, and one of the key things that came through was that multi-agency approach. And I think you're right in terms of government needs to kind of almost lead in that. But I think the point you mentioned about Jim talked about the postcode lottery. I mean, even within schools, the education, some teachers understand it better than others. Within the health service, some doctors understand it better than others. So I suppose there's a kind of question. One is in terms of we need to look at it from a health authority, local authority kind of point of view. The other thing as well is it kind of comes down to is almost talking about workforce planning, because in terms of do we have enough people who are qualified in the area to talk around about, if you're talking about the explosion number of people who are going through the treatments, do we have enough people in the services at the moment? And if not, do we need to start planning for that now? Because I think you quite clearly see some of the restrictions are in about the waiting list and so on. So do we need to look at workforce planning, for example? Because if we need to deal with this properly, we can put guidelines in place, we can look at structures in place. But if we don't have the people, that's going to delay the issue. So I don't know if you've thought around about the workforce planning in local authorities, in GP surgeries, and obviously through the services you provide as well.
Yeah, it's a massive issue, and things, and it's. I mean, we've been talking about it for decades, and things, and it's really right across the board. But I agree. I think this is where it needs to be a sort of universal understanding. If you remember, with the child protection stuff, the report was the iconic report was named. It's everybody's job to make sure I'm all right, and it's kind of the same with this. It's like everybody's job to understand and to get it that people are different and. They'll need things done differently and things. So I think it needs to be part of the basic universal training, and whether that's for new people coming in or people who are already in post, in the same way you have to do your child protection training, you have to do your ND awareness training and things, and that's part of people who are doing the supervision and support for that need to be aware of that, because it's absolutely game changing for children, and whether their teacher gets it or not, and whether they've built in a standard movement breaks and a different offer, a quiet corner, whatever. It makes an absolute huge difference and things. So and the workforce issues are massive, absolutely massive, and should not be underestimated, and it's getting worse. Certainly we would be more knowledgeable about what's going on in health. But if you look at the age of the workforce, yeah, it's not going in the right direction at all. You know, the levels of, you know, that, you know, for example, a fair amount of money has been given to CAMS over the last decade and things, and it's gone into some professional groups, like increase in psychology. The number of psychiatrists has gone down, you know, where there's not enough, and certainly for this population, I think the AHPs, you know, the occupational therapists and the speech and language therapists have a real additional, you know, they bring a lot, yeah, for this group of children and young people. So and for adults. So, you know, so it needs a sort of richness of that, and again mobilise people who have, you know, have kids and have a lot of knowledge. You know,
I suppose to follow on from that, I think it's one of these situations where it's a yes and an and as the answer to that. Actually, we always need more workforce. We need to plan for this. But again, if we think about the scale of the problem, the scale of the need, something like obesity, actually thinking, well, actually, we will never be able to train enough specialist staff to meet this need. Yep. It just can't. You cannot have everybody in Scotland who's obese seen by a consultant consultant surgeon. It's just not going to happen. So actually, what do we do right across the system? And how do we, you know, things like mandatory training. So actually everybody in the public sector should be trained in neurodiversity awareness and in the supports, and having that. So one of the pillars we've recommended is about investing in national training packages. Yep. So no matter where you are in Scotland, you can access training, and then you can start to offer people support, because often these aren't very straightforward things, but it's, you know, knowledge is power, it's understanding what can help. And the other thing as well is we need to be really conscious that we are in a public mental health epidemic just now, that as Leonie said at the beginning, we're in an environment which is increasingly toxic to people's mental well-being, whether you're neurodiverse or you're not. And an analogy might be, you know, many decades ago, we faced a crisis in Britain with lung conditions. You know, a huge number of our workforce were incapacitated because of chest conditions. We didn't only build clinics to diagnose TB and asthma. We looked at smoking, we looked at air quality. And we absolutely have to get on the front foot here. You know, there's research that's coming out all the time, but we know now that excessive screen time, social media use, causes ADHD symptoms whether you have a diagnosis or not, particularly if you're a young person. And actually what we don't want to be doing is just creating, we don't create clinics only to diagnose asthma in young people. We don't limit cigarette access only to young people with a diagnosis of asthma. We limit, you know, we give clear advice and we legislate to protect young people right across society. And we need to do the same for all the environmental factors that can make neurodiversity more challenging for people.
Right. Thanks, Cliona. Very helpful.
Thank you. We have questions from Tess White, please.
Thank you, Convener. A few things that you've said have really resonated, and thank you for the report. Picking up the point about what do humans need to grow and thrive, also talking about Dr. Crabb in terms of the working practices. So my background's HR, and I think looking at human factors and human factors engineering is something that you've touched upon. But in your report, you did raise some concerns about the ability of the population to concentrate and focus on daily tasks. And you talked, there was a very good section, it's point 2 of your 10-point plan, where you've just mentioned it before, caffeine, psychoactive substances, alcohol, screen time, almost like the environment, the air that you breathe, the environment that you're in. Is there any world-leading research that's looking at, almost going back to the basics? And I grew up in the 1960s and the 1970s, and you drank water and you didn't have all these, these drinks. And I understand that some people 50% of the energy that they consume is ultra-processed foods. So in terms of connecting the dots, is there any research out there that's actually doing and looking and having the data of what you've been talking about?
The answer is yes. I mean, there is research coming out all the time, but we have done rapid reviews of the evidence, and we have worked with our colleagues in NHS Inform, so we are updating the NHS Inform guides for ADHD, and it is including these factors. But as mentioned before, it's not, these factors don't just affect you if you have a diagnosis of ADHD, they affect the whole population. But if you have a diagnosis of ADHD, you're more vulnerable and you're more likely to be harmed by these effects. And it is these environmental things, that are affecting all of our mental well-being and our ability to focus and concentrate and to think deeply about problems and to arrive at a flow state, which is so important in terms of people's cognitive development and young people's development. And these are things like having good sleep, enough high-quality sleep, screen time, social media use, caffeine, exercise. And we can very quickly and rapidly summarise that evidence, and we need to go out and be honest to the public because there's nothing to guide them just now. We do this with alcohol, about 14 units a week. We know that lots of people don't stick to that, but a heck of a lot of people do. And it means that we have really clear guidance right across society, right across the system, to show people this is what you need to do to stay healthy. And before we do anything else, let's make sure those things are under control, because in my own practice, nothing is more tragic than someone has waited 6 years to see you for an assessment, and those first-line things have never been tackled. And you have to say, look, you may have a neurodevelopmental condition, but first of all, we've got to sort all these other things out because they may well be presenting like ADHD. And similarly, if I'm going to help you, if you have a diagnosis of ADHD, we need to sort these things out as well. So actually, the first thing is to say, let's sort all these factors out and give the public really clear advice. So no matter where you go, there's really clear advice about how much you're sleeping, what's your caffeine intake like, what's your screen time like, what's your exercise levels like, what's your ultra-processed food intake like.
And the noise, as you say, when schools designed the open plan and whatever, did they actually think about the human factors? Just before I go on, I do have a question about private diagnosis, but the National Library of Medicine was quoted as the consequences of ultra-processed foods on brain development and the elevated amounts of sugar, fat, sodium, food additions and dietary emulsifiers, pointing out that a lot of what people are eating and drinking not only has an effect on what's happening in the womb and development there, but also, so you, Dr. Bowen, you actually say, you're nodding your head there. Could you say a few more words about that?
I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but there is research going on that has shown links with increased sort of, I think, mental distress in relation to, and performance on focus and concentration in relation to ultra-processed foods, but it's not my area of expertise. But there is, work going on around about a range of I suppose, lifestyle things and daily things, such as there's the, within Public Health Scotland, there's a working group on the digital determinants of mental health who are doing really good work on that. They just had their second meeting yesterday. There's also Generation Scotland within Edinburgh University that's doing some really fine-tuned work looking at the hour-by-hour tracking of the effect of social media use on mood and mental health and sleep patterns as well. There's Helen Minnis through and Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry through in Glasgow University, doing some really interesting, challenging work on the relationship between trauma and early attachment and neurodevelopmental conditions. And she talks of a sort of double jeopardy, whereas if you've got, if you have both things going on in your life, you have a sort of a more than twice worth outcomes. They're additive, all these risk factors that go together. So, so keeping children safe, letting them grow and develop and play all helps.
Play outside.
Yeah, so there's lots of work going on, and I know that the digital stuff's a real hot potato at the moment kind of thing, but there's lots of research going on around, but I think there's also a degree of urgency, and I know Jim feels particularly passionately about this.
I think we do. I think we have the lessons from history where actually we waited decades before. There was literally no argument about cigarette smoking and lung disease. And actually, we know there's more than enough evidence just now that actually these lifestyle factors, they harm all of the population, but they disproportionately harm people who are neurodivergent. And we cannot wait another year, 2 years, 3 years till there's another 10, 20 studies. We have enough now to advise the public, and we would ask the committee to use its influence to make sure that we are able to issue national guidance within 6 months for the public, and then every year we update that guidance as new evidence emerges. But what we can't do is fail the people of Scotland by waiting another 5 years to give them advice about how they can protect themselves, protect their mental well-being, and protect the family's mental well-being.
And in terms of, you talk about, is it 45,000 people waiting for diagnosis, and a huge amount, I think almost more than half that are children. But where people are going for a private diagnosis, is there a huge risk because they're only looking, as you talked about, silo, they're not looking at holistically. Could you talk bit about that?
I mean, we would strongly advocate for holistic assessments and taking a sort of, we call it a biopsychosocial approach, where you're looking at biological things like family history and exposure to cigarette smoking, pregnancy, all that kind of risk factors, premature birth and things. It's psychological factors, which might include sort of trauma and life experiences, and then social factors as well, like social exclusion and things. So we would advocate for looking at all of these factors, taking a trauma-informed approach, and then looking right across the board for neurodevelopmental differences. So, because if you look just for autism, you'll find autism, but you might miss the ADHD. If you look just for ADHD, it's very easy to misinterpret hyperactivity, impulsivity and distractibility, which might be caused by trauma or actually somebody who's autistic and really dysregulated by their sensory environment. So if you only look through a really narrow lens, you've got blinkers on and you'll miss the big picture. So that's a particular, we would, and there's some places within the NHS are still doing single diagnosis assessment. We would strongly advocate that there's not separate waiting lists for different conditions and things, but we would also strongly advocate within the private sector that we are doing holistic assessments rather than single diagnostic assessments.
There's a real danger in single condition assessments. Put bluntly, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And there's tens and hundreds of different psychiatric conditions, many of which can present with features that seem suggestive of neurodivergency, or you can present with neurodivergency and another condition. So there needs to be holistic assessments, and we need to keep really high standards. And it's this dual position where it's not a diagnosis good or bad. It's diagnosis can be really important for some people, but it needs to be done to the highest standards by people who are properly qualified and supervised and trained to do that. And lots of people might not need a diagnosis to get the help that they need. And it's these different things that we find where actually sometimes the help and support that people need are the same whether they have traits or the disorder. And it's a tragedy when people wait years to get a diagnosis for these supports to be offered.
But then do they need a diagnosis if you're saying, and I will pass back to the convener, if you're saying there could be multifactorial issues, could be diet, could be what they're drinking, could be what they're smoking, could be that you've got to eradicate those. So is the data being kept and being recorded to actually to say it might not be ADHD or might not be this, it could be something else?
This is why we recommend the different pillars be taken forward, that actually, if there is really clear advice to the public about these are lifestyle factors that everybody should follow, and particularly if you think you might be neurodivergent, it's particularly important you do this, and why there's initial first-line supports in the community provided by the third sector. And then if you're still struggling, then the step up would be, actually, do we need to try and find out what might be going on? And just to make a few other points about the issues around diagnosis as well, there is a cultural component to this as well, and it can be incredibly difficult when somebody's waited 4 or 5 years to see, and you've spent 5 or 6 hours assessing them. You say you are a complex human being. There's lots of factors going on here. You have traits of neurodiversity, but you don't meet the diagnostic criteria. People can become hugely upset and say, "This is a community I identify with. Who are you to say that I'm not a member of that community?" And then often there's complaints, and there's second and third and fourth opinions, and we can become stuck in this toxic cycle where people feel they need the diagnosis to join a community that they identify with.
Back to you, convener. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to come in on that point, I agree. I don't think anybody would disagree that getting a good night's sleep, eating properly, less processed food, and doom scrolling on our phones would do us all a bit of good to cut out. And as you say, it probably disproportionately affects people who are neurodivergent. But in fact, that could be indicators also of neurodivergence, that you're seeking out those behaviours. So it's maybe not one leading to another, but an indicator of that. If you know anybody who's had an ADHD baby, I think they could talk to you all day about sleep. Talking about misdiagnosis in terms of men and women. So misdiagnosis, not the fact that you're saying there may be people who are misdiagnosed as autistic and ADHD. Are there people who are not diagnosed ADHD or autistic who have been diagnosed with personality disorders, for example? There seems to be a disproportionate amount of women who are diagnosed with personality disorders, and there seems to be a gap where there's more men who are diagnosed with autism. straight out, I mean, is that misogyny in our healthcare?
Gosh, enormous question. I think just so it isn't missed, so just to get back to your sort of opener there as well, I would very much agree that some of the behaviours are sort of presenting issues like poor sleep and certain behaviours. I think they definitely can be indicators of actually neurodevelopmental conditions. So it's not either or. I can't state it strongly enough.
Yeah.
You know, it's not lifestyle, adaptations or diagnosis. You know, it's much more nuanced than that. It is complicated. People are complicated. So, so it's definitely not either or. And it needs the main thing is that it needs to be what people actually need in a timely way. You know, and that might change. That will almost certainly change over time, depending where they are on life's journey. So the thing to do with the gender differences, gosh, that's a multi-million-dollar question. I think the differences in how males and females, show their behaviours relating to their underlying neurodivergence, that affects how obvious it is. And I suppose it's human nature in overstretched systems that it's the boy who is externalising their angst that will be picked up more quickly than the girl who goes quiet and is no problem to anybody and they're doing fine and things. So, and I think we're getting better at that, undoubtedly, yeah. But again, that's where we get back to the need for universal training so that every teacher has, training and knowledge round about kind of neurodiversity and the different kinds of ways it might present. And I missed earlier that needs to be trauma-informed as well, because they all overlap. Life is messy and things. So I think that's definitely affected it. And it's quite interesting over, the data on increasing referrals to CAMHS, which may or may not be for an underlying neurodevelopmental condition. It's over the last 20 years, it's gone up exponentially, yeah. And it used to be 20 years ago, it was about 50-50 boys and girls. And now it's twice as many girls as boys are being referred into CAMHS services. This is research that Ian Kelleher, Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry in Edinburgh, published just in December. So, so there are differences. I think the pickup rate is changing and things. I also think it's likely that girls are more sensitive at various vulnerable points to social media messaging and things, so regarding the personality diagnosis things, I think it's really complicated. Yeah, that will look different in different stages of people's lives. Sometimes a personality disorder diagnosis can be really useful for some people, understanding why they might have a lot of emotional liability and why they respond in certain ways. But I would very much, that needs to be embedded within a sort of helpful formulation. Again, it's not something that we do to people. It needs to be something that's a conversation and a shared narrative and understanding. And there will be overlap. I think Jim's probably more as a general adult psychiatrist will be able to comment on that than I am. But I think it's really nuanced. And I think, again, even as part of the training for psychiatrists, to make sure that they are also trained really well in understanding neurodevelopmental differences and how that might affect how somebody would respond in a social environment or a sensory environment, and the role of overload and things. So, so again, we should be able to think about people as the complex humans that they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Crabb, do you think that there is perhaps a lack of awareness or understanding? There needs to be more sufficient training for people to spot how women with neurodivergence present to the world?
I think the first thing is diagnosis should always be completely objective. There should never be any prejudice. But it comes back to this point that we are dealing with the human mind and the human brain, which is the biggest supercomputer in the known universe. And actually, most people don't fit neatly into one diagnosis or another. Sometimes there's multiple diagnoses. But again, in the UK particularly, we're often taught to think in a very binary way. It's this thing or it's another thing, and it can't be both things. Or maybe people have traits of lots of different things. And you're absolutely right that we need to have training right across the system so people have that flexibility of thought. And it does come back to this is the danger of people being advertised single condition assessments. If you only look for one thing, that's all you'll find. And actually lots of people can be neurodivergent and they can have traits of personality disorder. And I think a point we want to make really clearly is that actually personality disorder can be an incredibly helpful diagnosis for people. Most people who have personality disorder have suffered psychological trauma. So there's nothing wrong with having that diagnosis. The point of any diagnosis, whether it's personality disorder or neurodivergency or something else, is to make sure the person gets meaningful help. And to mean that when they go from one person to another, that meaningful help looks the same and it doesn't change. So it is absolutely right that we need to have more awareness and more training right across the system. And it starts with really having a national position that we don't have single condition assessments anymore. We offer holistic assessments. And when you do have a diagnosis, it's done by somebody who's properly trained and qualified.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody would disagree that having a diagnosis that is fit and proper would not be helpful to anyone. It's that the data there in regards to men and women is quite stark. So I do think it is worth digging into and delving into and asking the why around it, and not putting any shame on any diagnosis whatsoever. Just asking the why around it is helpful. We now have questions from Marie McNair, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. A majority of my own casework has been from folk trying to, navigate that minefield of access and diagnosis and support. So I'm really interested to see what more can be done to help remove those barriers. You kind of covered the question I was going to ask, but I'll ask it anyway and see if we can expand on it. It's obviously your report calls for a dedicated funding to address cross-societal approaches for autism and ADHD, and about the need for like a separate national strategy for mental illness and mental wellbeing. Could you expand a bit more on that? I know you've touched on it in several responses, but if you've got anything else to add, it'd be helpful to the committee.
Certainly for children and young people that I talk to. I think kids, most of them spend most of their time at home and at school, not in a clinic. Yeah, so actually having the resource and the understanding of them where they spend their lives, is much more important, isn't it? So so I think having any of the more sort of special, and there's a lot of expertise already within education and within communities. Yeah. So again, making that less of a postcode lottery. There's been lots of pilots of tests of change across Scotland. There was one in Highland that was led by, occupational therapists. There's in Fife, they're looking at educational psychologists joining up with MD services. In Lanarkshire, Children's First have done a fantastic project on a sort of whole family, multi-systemic approach to support that's again led by, life experienced, people supporting families, accessing what they need and navigating the complexities of services and things. So there's been lots of good examples that have evidence that they work. Making the most of that. It doesn't have to look exactly the same in every area, but the principles need to be the same, of accessible help. And I suppose no wrong door. That whether the kid has been, the issues are raised by the family or the GP or at school or the nursery or through paediatrics. They might present with, functional symptoms or difficulties coping with a chronic condition, and that's where it's seen that they're actually potentially neurodivergent and things. That there shouldn't be any wrong door into being able to access, either educational specialist assessments. So the improved universal offer helps everybody. And things, and then even access to sort of consultation. So maybe where there's something more specialist like a CAM service that we've got the capacity to provide consultation rather than just the sort of one door of the endless waiting list and things. So maybe a little drop of our input can make a big difference and sort of empower and help people just get on with what they need to do. But some will always need the more complex assessment. So I would sort of make reference to the sort of the sort of steps that NATE, the National Autism Implementation Team, have done a really excellent job across sectors and across sort of professional groups as well. So, so we would really endorse their approach and things. So again, sort of a no wrong door approach in the way that we would advocate a sort of cross-governmental approach, try and reduce the silo thinking. It's the same in the community. It's right across all stages. So.
Yeah, right time, right place, right person. Yeah. Sorry.
And just to follow on from that, and we've suggested additional and separate funding because just now the specialist mental health system is designed and resourced to meet the needs of about 1% of the population. So mental health services, psychiatry, we've traditionally seen people with severe and enduring conditions such as schizophrenia, which affect about 1% of the population. This is an area of need which is 10 to 20% of the population. And this is why we're experiencing the situation where the whole system is a meltdown, because we're trying to fit 20% of the people in Scotland into a system that's built for 1%. So we need different dedicated ring-fenced funding. And we're hugely excited about the proposal that there's going to be that come in the budget, and we'd be fully supportive of that. I think the next thing then is, how is that money spent? So how is it spent so it does its most good for as many people as possible in Scotland? And that's really where we need this national commissioning approach. We need really high standards where it's evidence-based, that we really walk it like we talk it in terms of our values. So actually we help as many people as possible. What we commission is as accessible, it's evidence-based, it helps as many people as possible, and there's no wrong doors. And actually, so people get help in their hands, their family gets help way before they get stuck, and they can keep moving in their lives.
Oh, absolutely. Kind of one of the cases that I did have, obviously, the response I got back was 3 years, 8 months, and youngster of 14, so they really nearly approaching 18 before, they got a diagnosis, and, saying that obviously you don't need a diagnosis to get support, but I mean, how realistic is it to get support? As obviously support comes in many forms, obviously, self-help and obviously peer support, but it's not the case, and it's the impact that has on, the whole family.
Yeah, it's hugely variable, which is part of the issue. It is really properly a postcode lottery for what they'll get. 3.5 years is quite quick. Across, if you look nationally, that's super speedy, unfortunately, and things. And it kind of depends what they need, whether that's a suitable list for them to be waiting on or not, and things. But I think that's, again, it needs the governmental authority, to say, actually needs led, but it depends what the young person needs.
Making that connection to other areas like obesity and saying, actually, just now, everyone in Scotland is waiting 5-10 years to see a consultant gastroenterologist to be diagnosed with obesity before anything is done about that problem. And about saying, actually, we would not countenance that approach in obesity, but this is the situation when we need to move from where we are to actually saying, well, we still do need consultant gastroenterologists to help people with obesity, but we need this whole tiered approach. And we need to make sure that any money and resources we have is spent really wisely, so that it's be hugely easy to squander the money. The money that's being proposed, you could employ 20 or 30 or 40 clinicians per year to do a few more assessments, which would take a tiny dent out of the waiting list, and then all the money would be gone. Or we could spend it in a different way, as we propose, which is actually moving that money out into society and getting that help into people's hands.
I don't think you'll have any problem having some assistance on this committee to lobby the Scottish Government. Thank you. Okay, thank you. We now have a question from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel, and thank you for all the information you have provided this morning. Before I go on to my main question, I want to stick on a question on the diagnosis side. NHS England has been considering plans to test children identifying as transgender for autism. This was one of the CAS review's recommendations, which the government claims to have accepted. Studies have found that those identifying as trans are 3 to 6 times more likely to receive an autism diagnosis. So do you believe that this is something that the NHS Scotland should be looking into as well?
I mean, very often the research is transferable, so if they're doing good quality research in England, we can learn from that, but I think Glasgow University have been commissioned to do some form of work. Again, it's not particularly my area of expertise, but they've been commissioned to do some work looking at the relationship between sort of transgender issues and sort of wider presentations as well. But again, that's why it's really important that we see people as whole, complex beings. Being trans is one element of their humanness. And being autistic is one element of their humanness and things. So again, it's not either or. We have to listen with respect to people's feelings about themselves, you know, and without judgment. So again, I don't think it's an either or, but I think it's crucial that we give children and young people space to grow and try things out and find out who they are in the world, whatever shape or form that might be. I know the trans things have become a real sort of politicised hot potato, unfortunately, and things, but actually it's all just about being human and who am I in the world, yeah, and that is one element of that for people. So I think it's more important that we just listen with respect, you know.
But obviously, you have said that we do have to help every child,
yeah,
and make sure that they're diagnosed right. I think that's probably the most important thing, to make sure that they have that diagnosis. And there's nothing that yourself or Dr. Jim you've looked into this at all, or have you done anything any work around this?
Not personally. Again, it wouldn't be my area of expertise, other than I've had a lot of experience within my general work in CAMS of working with people who are, you know, have transgender wonderings or feelings or strongly present in that way. There's a whole sort of spectrum of presentation round about it. So again, but I would think of them as complex humans. Yeah.
My understanding of the research that was cited in the CAS report is that actually there is a large proportion of young people who identify as being trans who are also neurodivergent. And it's about, I suppose, the degree to which that neurodivergency might influence their ability or wish to engage in treatment for other aspects in their life as well. And I think it just really is to support this point of actually we shouldn't just be thinking about neurodivergency if we're assessing a young person. We should be thinking about everything. There's tens and hundreds of different mental health presentations. There are hundreds of factors which are not psychiatric that influence young people as well. And this is the importance of having a really well-rounded holistic assessment. I think if you're assessing young persons, whether you're in a transgender medicine clinic or a mental health clinic, you need to be doing a holistic assessment to a high standard.
Okay. Thank you. I'll go into my main question now. Thank you for that. What engagement have you had with the Scottish Government and with other public bodies regarding your report and how it has been received by autistic people and people with ADHD in Scotland?
Thank you. So we've had really, really positive engagement, and just to express our thanks to people around the table today for inviting us here. And to all your colleagues across the Scottish Parliament. So we had a launch in October of our paper. It's been endorsed by all of the main political parties. It's been endorsed by the Minister for Mental Wellbeing. And the Royal College of Psychiatrists, we are part of the Mental Health Partnership, which is a coalition of 21 organisations representing lived experience, and they've supported our paper as well. And we've had individual meetings with third sector partners who also represent third sector organisations working with neurodivergent people. And I think it's really important to say our paper is the start of a process. It's not the end. So we've identified 10 areas across this fiendishly complex landscape where if we take forward pieces of work, we can move the situation to a better place. But it's incredibly important now that we engage with all stakeholders, and particularly people with lived experience, to actually say, what's the end point going to look like? And then it's really important now that actually we start to deliver, so that in 12 months' time, we're not just saying, this is a really complicated area, there's a huge need, something needs to be done. We can actually say we've started to deliver help and support that people need.
Obviously, while there is more recognition of neurodivergence in recent years, you can see that, you know, more's coming out, and obviously looking at your report as well, neurodivergent people are still facing a lot of challenges. For example, autistic people are 9 times more likely to die by suicide, with as many as a shocking of 66% of autistic adults having thoughts about suicide during their lifetime. When we took evidence on the delay of the Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill, we spoke to people with real-life experiences who said that they felt as if they were at the bottom of the pile when it came to the Scottish Government's priorities. So do you believe that neurodivergent people are being failed?
I think just now the current system is failing. It's failing everybody in Scotland. And I think, just to reiterate those terrible statistics you said, yeah, It's life expectancy is 6 to 8 years less for someone who has ADHD compared to the general public. And it is scandalous. And just now, it's because we are trying to fit 10 to 20% of the population into a system which is always designed for 1% of the population. So, of course, we're failing people. And, of course, not getting the help they need. And then they become stuck in their life and they become despondent and filled with despair. And then there's terrible outcomes. But it really highlights the need that we have to think differently about this situation. We have to start to deliver. And it would be a terrible tragedy in a year's time. We just say, well, we've got some ring fence money. We've done a waiting list initiative. We've done a couple of projects. There's still this huge need. People are waiting years and decades for help and support. It would be a tragedy. We need to move forward and actually start to deliver things this year.
Thank you. Is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I would agree. It's a very pertinent question as well. So, yes, for the most part, I think we are failing, but there's some real areas of improvement that are really exciting. So I think it's important we don't become too downhearted, but it is really important that, you know, things galvanise to make meaningful and sustained change. You know, quite a lot of the areas where there's exciting and evidence-based really good outcomes, you know, it's short-term funding that isn't sustained. So people put a ton of really good expertise and work and relationship building and things and get, you know, good outcomes, yeah. And then actually the funding doesn't continue. So all of that work, you know, and things. So I think that's a really important aspect of it. And thinking about this, you know, the really awful statistics that you quote there, again, it's you know, again, it's a whole society thing. There are social determinants of suicide and people being excluded, feeling excluded, yeah, not having meaningful purpose and worth in the world. And that's a complex thing that's really important, as well as people who are neurodivergent. They are much more likely to have co-occurring mental health disorders, which are treatable. Yeah. So again, being able to have that identified and get access to timely treatment for that and support is absolutely crucial as well. So, but it needs a multifaceted, joined up approach. It's not either or.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you. We're just coming to the end of our first session this morning. And just on that end in there, I think we are living in a society, and please correct me if you disagree, where people do seek to understand themselves a bit better. And I think that's a very positive thing for people to be self-reflective and to question why they behave or think in particular ways. And I would put it to you, we've spoken a lot about the individual and adjustments for the individual. And if we think about yesteryear, perhaps there was always this amount of neurodivergent people. It's just that there wasn't as much self-reflection and maybe behaviours were shamed in the past. A lot of people were in health institutions. A lot of people ended up in prison. A lot of people ended up isolated and maybe tagged as the eccentric in the village type thing. And I think now we have a greater understanding of that. So instead of, as well as supporting the individual with adjustments, would it be better if we looked at a whole society approach and how the world is created and set up for neurotypical individuals? And would that be better to have that bigger approach to ensure that society is set up for everyone and that there doesn't have to be this adjustments all the time? Okay. I'll come to you first.
I mean, I think that statistic of 43% of kids having ASN needs says it all, you know, and things that actually it does need a societal approach, and that's the universal offer that I keep reflecting on, that it needs to be more flexible, more kinder. Yeah, you know, and actually it's good that we're all different. You know, this has happened for evolutionary reasons, you know, and it is wonderful that we're all more able to think about ourselves. I think the stresses of the way that the world is now mean that we have to think harder about that, yeah, because it's more, you know, it's been such a fast development of how much the world and our daily lives have changed over the last sort of 100 years and the last 20 years with the digital things, that actually our brain evolution has not kept up with that. So we're having to think harder about how do I survive and how does this work, because we're you know, where our lives are different and things. So absolutely, I couldn't agree more that it needs a whole societal approach, and it's really is fine for us all to be different. Yeah, it's really not a problem, and it's actually a real advantage to do that. And the more we can help support people get through their daily lives and quietly or loudly thrive, yeah, the more they will be able to contribute to society. And things, and they'll be able to pay their taxes. They'll be able to have a wonderful idea. They'll be able to bring joy. They'll be able to parent well. You know, it goes on how people will be able to contribute. You know, so there's it gets us into a virtuous cycle. Yeah, if from the get-go we're able to accept that there's real advantages for people having differences. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you, Dr. Grab.
Yep, just to echo that, I mean, I think Melanie said that beautifully. I couldn't really improve on that. If we're talking 10 to 20% of the population, then we do need to think about re-engineering society. And certainly, you know, looking forward, it would make sense that, yeah, if you were to commission a public building, then actually you need to think about making it neurodivergent friendly. Why would you not? If you're designing a policy or procedure in an organisation, why would you not make it neurodivergent friendly? So we'd absolutely support that needs to change right across society. I suppose we are where we are just now, isn't it? And today it's about actually saying, what can we do this year to start to put things on a better trajectory? My own experience in trying to manage a small part of the health and social care system, you could spend millions of pounds repurposing a single building. And unfortunately, we just don't have the resources this year to re-engineer all the things that we would want to do. So that's why we've recommended the pillars of work that we start with actually giving people advice, reasonable adjustments. Maybe they shouldn't have to be called reasonable adjustments, but for now, that's a good enough starting position, because we have to start to make things better. We can't continue to fail people in Scotland. We can start to give people the help they need so they can navigate a world that is far from perfect. And they'll have the opportunity to flourish.
Okay, thank you very much. That brings this panel to a close. And I want to thank you both for your evidence today. We will now suspend briefly for a changeover of our witness panels. Thank you. Welcome back. We will now move on to our second evidence session, and this session will take place in a roundtable format. And I would like to welcome Debbie Best, Director, Disabled Scotland, KB Brooke, Chairperson, ARGH Scotland, Sophia Farzana, Director and Co-Founder, Scottish Ethnic Minority Autistics, Marion McLaughlin, Managing Director and Founder, Aurora Autistic Consulting, Rachel Parker, Founding Trustee, Autistic Voices Advocating Together for Autonomous Rights, Caroline Scott, Founder and Researcher, ADHD Right Now, Leo Stars Cunningham, Treasurer, Autistic Mutual Aid Society, Edinburgh. I hope I got all that right. You're all very welcome to join us this morning. I'm going to begin our conversation this morning by inviting everyone to very briefly say their name and the organisation you're from, introducing yourselves to everyone. And I will begin. So I'm Karen Adam, MSP for Banffshire and Buchan Coast, and I'm convener of this committee.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maggie Chapman, MSP. I'm Deputy Convener of this committee and an MSP for North East Scotland region. And while I've got the microphone, if I may, Convener, just to declare an interest, Caroline Scott and I worked together in a previous role when I worked for the Scottish Council on Vision Impairment prior to being elected. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Pam Gossel. I'm a member of this committee, but I'm also an MSP, regional MSP for the West of Scotland. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Caroline Scott from ADHD Right Now.
Good morning, folks. My name is Marie McNair. I'm the MSP for Clydebank and Mulgai constituency in the West of Scotland.
Hi, I'm Sophia Farzana and I'm the Director of Scottish Ethnic Minority Autistics.
Hi, I'm Leo and I'm the Treasurer of AMAZE, or the Autistic Mutual Aid Society, Edinburgh.
Hello, I'm Iris and I'm here for support for Leo.
Hello, Tess White, MSP, North East region. Thank you.
Hello, Helen Gibson. I'm here to provide support for Debbie Best. Hello, I'm Debbie Best, Founding Director, Disabled Scotland.
Hi, I'm Paul McLennan. I'm a member of the committee and I'm the MSP for East Lothian.
Thank you. We'll now go to those joining us online, and I'll go in the order that I see. So is it Marion?
Hi, I'm Marion McLaughlin. I'm the Managing Director at Aurora Autistic Consulting, which houses Autistic Pride Aberdeen.
Thank you. And KB?
Hi, I'm KB Brooke. I'm here as a representative of ARG, which is a charity run by and for autistic adults.
Thank you. And Rachel?
I'm Rachel Parker. I'm founding trustee of Avatar, Autistic Voices Advocating Together for Autonomous Rights, which is the autistic people's organisation for the Scottish Borders.
That's great. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. We're now going to turn to the themes that we will be exploring, and members will introduce and take turns as we go round. So please indicate to me if you'd like to come in on any of these themes. If you're in the room, please just raise your hand and signal to myself or the clerks will pick that up. And if you're online, please do put an R in the chat, or if you want to type out a question, that's perfectly acceptable as well. So, first off, I'm going to turn to Maggie Chapman, who has a question.
Thanks very much, Karen. And hello again, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The first theme that I want to begin our exploration of is around access to assessments. Access to assessments, and then any treatment or medication that comes after that. So, really, my first question is, how long did you have to wait to get an assessment, and what is the impact of that wait on you as from your experience? I don't know who wants to pick that up first. Debbie, I saw you nodding along. Do you want to go first?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So if I go to chronological age, I had to wait 53 years for assessment. I was diagnosed 6 years ago. As autistic, it was flagged up that I displayed ADHD traits, but that was not taken any further. This just happened just pre-COVID. So yeah, it took a lifetime to really kind of work out that I was neurodivergent and doing everything differently. And I think that process for me took 2 years at that point, but I am now still on the wait list for ADHD assessment.
Okay, thank you. Marion.
I was in the position where when I asked for an assessment, there wasn't an assessment pathway available at all. So it took 6 months of going back and forward and being told I didn't qualify for an assessment because I didn't have any mental health diagnoses, which I laughed at heartily, because if anyone looked at my notes, they would see that I had anxiety pretty much my entire life. And it wasn't until I hit absolute burnout and called up the hospital in tears in the middle of a shutdown before I was able to access an assessment, at which point they said, OK, Mrs McLaughlin, we'll see you in a month's time. And even then I didn't know what was going to happen. And so I really had to hit the worst mental health that I'd ever had in my life, while my own child was going through their own issues, trying to start primary school and everything as well. So I don't think that people realise all the different things that actually go on whenever you are trying to access an assessment too. I was in the fortunate position that 3 weeks after I got my assessment, I was able to join the working group that ultimately set up the assessment pathway that we had in Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire. And very, very quickly that filled up incredibly fast. And people had a long wait, but they knew that it was coming. They knew that it was going to be there in the end. So whenever the assessment pathways started closing down, that's whenever we had people getting in touch saying that they'd lost hope, basically. Not having access to that at all meant that they were questioning everything and what was the point, and it made everything so much harder. But I mean, speaking for myself, knowing that I am autistic was meant that I felt able to go and access the community, that I felt better able to advocate for my own rights, that I felt like I could make a difference for my community in a way that I couldn't do before. It's been absolutely life-changing, and I would say life-saving for me as well.
Thank you, Marion. Caroline.
To take Debbie's approach, then I'll be 57 by the time I have an NHS diagnosis, because I don't just look young for my age, but in my health board, the waitlist is now 17 years. I sought a private diagnosis after being misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder when I was 20, when, understandably, because there wasn't a diagnostic criteria for women, then you could not be diagnosed with ADHD. When I went to my GP 2 years ago, I went at the wrong time, because lots of people were going for ADHD referrals. And that meant NHS Health Board started rejecting referrals and triaging them. Mine was rejected on the basis that my GP hadn't written about childhood experiences. My GP hadn't been told to and didn't know to. By the time I then went back to the GP, filled in all the forms again, which for someone with ADHD can take some time. We're not very good at that kind of stuff. The waitlist had grown. I was deterred from joining it. I was told, what do you actually hope to achieve from an ADHD diagnosis anyway? And explaining that I just wanted to know that all the things that have gone wrong in my life, the failures, the dropping out of uni, that they were because of a disability. I was finally put back on the waitlist. But having seen that the waitlist was 17 years, I looked into private diagnosis. I don't believe in private healthcare. I believe that it widens inequalities. But it was desperation. I couldn't afford it. I put it on a credit card. I thought I'd have access to medication. But now I'm also on a health board that doesn't provide shared care. So I'll be 17 years until I can get the medication that for the last 2 years of my life has been absolutely life-changing.
Thanks, Karen. Sophia.
So I first realised I was most probably autistic after some teacher training. It was optional in my area, and then I realised that my son was, and that explained his mental health difficulties. But then when I went to, like Marion, there was no pathway. I got referred to a psychiatrist who then, when I said to them, I would like to get an assessment because I think I am autistic, the response was, no, you just got some beta blockers will help you and just leave your abusive marriage and you'll be fine. 6 years later, after that is when, no, 3 years later is when I had really severe burnout and I went back and I got put onto a waiting list. And then when I did finally 2 more years, got my diagnosis after 2 hours of seeing a psychiatrist. It was like, oh, it must be very mild because you've got so far, without actually taking into account how difficult and painful life was, or a miracle that I'm still alive. But then when I asked for ADHD diagnosis assessment as well, I was told, no, it's just generalised anxiety disorder, and I was just given some anxiety medication, which particular one is actually really bad for people with ADHD, which cause even more problems. And then, because I had to keep pushing back with the psychiatry, I actually went through 5 psychiatrists, one who then did prescribe me medication just to prove me wrong, without any assessment, any questions asked. Here you go, take some medicine. And he was, surprised that I reacted differently as he had expected. And in fact, he had to admit that I was ADHD, because I was told as you get older, ADHD goes down by the psychiatrist. And subsequently, when I challenged them and their attitudes, the following psychiatrist removed that from my medical records. So my medical records has a letter to say I have ADHD, and I have another letter to say no, she's not. So I don't know which one my medical records would go for when I need extra help or support when I hit other parts of my life. So I was told when I was trying to seek the ADHD diagnosis that no, the pathway has been closed because there's no medicine, there's no medication, and that's the reason why we're not doing assessments, we're not taking referrals. And obviously now we know in Forth Valley that all the assessment pathways have been closed, so there's no way of me going back to say, can I get that reinstated and also get medicine, because I don't know where I'm standing, because they refuse to look into my case now.
Katie, I think you're wanting to come in.
Maybe, yeah. So I was diagnosed at 30, which is over 20 years ago now. But I had actually, my first interaction with a psychiatrist was when I was about 14, and I was in and out of mental health services for the whole time between 14 and 30. And like long periods of distress, my life was a mess. I didn't know who I was. I was screened for lots of things, but it was like, no, you don't fit that, no, you don't fit this. And they never mentioned autism at all. It just wasn't on their radar. And then eventually, the reason why I was referred for an assessment was my child was going through an assessment. And the people doing their assessment, obviously you get a lot of forms to fill in about what your child does that is unusual. And I was saying, but none of this is unusual. That's just me. That's how I am. That I'm all of these things. And the clinicians involved in his assessment said to me, oh, perhaps actually maybe you should have an assessment. And I think that's quite common actually with autistic parents who are not identified as autistic, having children who then are going through the process, and that is how they're picked up or how they recognise it themselves. And like during the time before diagnosis, things were happening. Like I was going through periods of burnout, and they were being the doctors thought that it was depression. So I was on all kinds of, I've had like every antidepressant that you could ever think of. I mean, sometimes I was depressed. My life was a bit of a mess, but no one understood me. And the major thing was I didn't understand myself. I just thought I was just a broken human, and that I was no good at being human, and that I didn't really deserve to be here because what use was I anyway? The difference that the assessment and then the diagnosis made was it sort of gave me self-worth and some validity to say, yeah, I am a real human, and I'm worth being here. I'm just an autistic human, and that's fine. And that also enabled me to connect with the autistic community, which then became pretty much my only support because there aren't very many services. So it was massive, life-changing, and actually saved the NHS a lot of money because I stopped sloshing around in the mental health system and like going to appointments that I didn't really need, that weren't very helpful and actually were sometimes quite harmful.
Thanks for that, Katie, and apologies for getting your name wrong. Rachel, I think you want to come in.
Yeah, so I wasn't diagnosed until I was 25, and that was following many years of what was explained away as mental health challenges and not being able to get better. through CBT and taking multiple antidepressants, and the belief that I just wasn't trying hard enough to get better. During that time, I dropped out of uni twice. I had to leave multiple jobs, and always believing that this was my own fault for not being able to manage in a way that everyone else around me seemed to be able to. And so getting my diagnosis gave me the opportunity to understand myself better and make requests for appropriate accommodations. And I eventually completed my degree with a first-class honours through the Open University, and that was 12 years after initially starting my higher education journey. Although I had a supportive GP and I was under a psychiatrist and the community mental health team, it was only my occupational therapist who eventually considered that I might be autistic after she attended a training about the gendered differences in autism presentations, and that she was wondering if this is why I kept giving her the wrong answers to my CBT assignments. Having been given the AQ10 screening test by her, I went home, Googled it, found out what it was that what the questions had been about, and read a lot about autism in women. And that all made so much sense to me of my experiences and the challenges that I'd been facing. But it still took over a year and multiple complaints and support from my local representative to eventually get an assessment.
Thanks, Rachel. Karen, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, thank you. I spoke of my own lived experience of access and assessment, but if I may, just to summarise some of the things that we've heard from the people that we've worked with who've tried to access ADHD assessment. Some of the most common things we hear are people being told that they're too successful to have ADHD because they've got a PhD or they've got a degree. People are told that I've had somebody who was told that they couldn't have ADHD because they were married and holding down a long-term relationship. And this is by GPs they're being told this. I've had other people being told that women being told they're just hormonal, they're just anxious, being treated for anxiety. And I don't blame GPs for this. There is a lack of understanding, there's a lack of education, a lack of awareness. But then we also have the fact that 30% of people in Scotland live in areas where they're unable to receive a neurodevelopmental assessment through the NHS at all. And that's been highlighted in research conducted by the Scottish Parliament's own information centre. So the fact that I'm on a 17-year wait list makes me one of the lucky ones. They're not allowed access to neurodevelopmental assessment unless they have significant co-occurring mental health conditions. And that decision-making has been made by GPs who are not given the support they need to make that decision. So 30% of people across Scotland just don't have access to assessment at all.
Thanks, Carolyn. Leah, do you want to come here?
Yeah, mine, unsurprisingly, is a different experience from all the others. I was diagnosed when I was 6, well over 40 years ago now. But throughout my life, when I've had adequate support and been very successful, either doctors or environments that I've worked in have attempted to challenge my diagnosis and challenge my support requirements. So having the diagnosis has been really helpful in terms of being able to hold the line and fight for the support that I need, which on the face of it, lots of people don't expect. I receive over 50 hours of support a week, but that has enabled me to I have multiple degrees. I've done high-level jobs at executive level when I've had that support, but quite often when I start to achieve, I can get burnout, and then that, as has been described by the others, that then gets seen as, well, you're just depressed, or it's the sort of pull your socks up mentality, and that's still, for somebody, despite my whole life and that whole experience and that weight of that diagnosis for all my life being behind me, that's still a challenge that I face quite regularly.
Thanks all very much for sharing your very personal experiences of that. Leah and Rachel, you both talked about support or appropriate adjustments and appropriate accommodations. And I suppose I'd like to just open it up. What are the kinds of things that you know work? And obviously they won't necessarily be the same things for everybody in different situations, but what are the kinds of things that you know work and that we should be thinking about more generally across society? So there is that awareness and understanding that Carolyn indicated was so lacking in some of the health care professionals. Who wants to kick that off? Leo, go for it.
Have to go. So my personal experience is that what has made the most difference is being able to have my support present with me and having that personal contact, almost having a mediator, so that I'm able to quite often process things afterwards in a way that is much more helpful for me and avoids misunderstanding. In terms of the environment, I would say that's the biggest challenge and the hardest to get adjustments on, because of the design of buildings. Having worked in different kinds of corporate environments, it's very hard to get corporations to make adjustments quite often of that kind. Part of that is because essentially the building should have been designed with people with different needs in mind, and there's still very much, in the environmental sense, a preponderance of focus on more visible disabilities that is right and it should be there, but it leaves those of us with visible disabilities, if we're lucky, on the sidelines. And when challenging that, that's quite often when my needs start to get questioned as well. How are they valid? You've done the job for, X weeks or X months successfully. Why do you need this change now? And it's like, well, I didn't need the change now. I actually need it at the beginning, but it's reached a point where I can't do what you want or what I want to do successfully enough without those adjustments. So, yeah.
Thanks, Leo. Sorry. Marion, do you want to come in? And then Sophia.
I kind of just wanted to put in that last year I spent a day at our local job centre speaking with neurodivergent job seekers, and one of the questions that I asked everybody was, what reasonable adjustments have you asked for? And the look that I got from everybody was like, what do you mean reasonable adjustments? So there's a lot of neurodivergent people who are out there who maybe know that they're neurodivergent or suspect that they're neurodivergent, but don't know anything about any reasonable adjustments at all. They don't know that they can ask for them whenever they're going for job interviews, so even before they access it, they don't know they can access them in education. They've no clue what a lot of them are. It's one of the reasons why on the Aurora website I've got a list of potential reasonable adjustments that people might want to access, because if people don't know what sort of things they can ask for, then they might not ask for anything at all. So I think that our rights and the access to reasonable adjustments needs to be made very, very clear to us at all points whenever we're trying to figure out whether or not we're neurodivergent.
Thanks, Marion. Sophia and then Carolyn.
One reasonable adjustment that has helped me was when going for job interviews, getting the questions in advance and giving time to actually bring in notes as well. It's unheard of beforehand. I don't know why it's not universal, but I'm from the education sector. That didn't help me get any jobs, because given that reasonable adjustment and being openly autistic and ADHD with the people recruiting, the fact that the questions were very ADHD also were the reason why the job was declined. So I can do all the prep in the world, but I can't change my non-linear thinking. So reasonable adjustments are only as good as the people's understandings you're giving them.
Thanks, Sophia. That's a helpful point to hear. Carolyn.
Yeah, I think given the difficulties with access to diagnosis, the first and foremost point would be that access to reasonable adjustments must be based on the lived experience of the individual and not on a formal diagnosis. I'm lucky to work in an environment where that's the case. There are some things that help people with ADHD, and they tend to be quite different, quite varied and very more individualised. ADHD coaching, for example, can be fantastic. It can be expensive. You can get it through Access to Work for 1 year without having to go through too many hoops, but by going on a 6 to 12 month waiting list for the Access to Work call. But I work in an education setting. I'm a university lecturer during the day. And I work with students who don't have a formal diagnosis, and they can't access ADHD coaching because they can't access to work because they're students. So it's not available to everybody, and it is something that can be incredibly useful. But the biggest thing with ADHD is that one of the things that is the best reasonable adjustment is having access to medication. It's not for everybody, it's not a cure, but it can mitigate against the negative outcomes. And fundamentally, the biggest reasonable adjustment we really need is a culture change. And I think, as Marion said, a lot of people themselves don't know that they have a right to claim reasonable adjustments. They think if they don't have a formal diagnosis, they have no rights to claim them. So we need an understanding and awareness of it. We need people to feel more confident in asking and understanding their rights. And we need people to start listening to and believing people with ADHD and autistic people.
Thanks, Karen. Debbie, yeah.
For me, probably the invalidation quite often. If you divulge and ask for a reasonable adjustment, I'm not talking about a work situation, but kind of social and general situations, you know, hospital, asking for help, problems in queues, GP practice, not being able to wait, and, you know, the phone line queuing system. And I did receive a response, you know, prior to, why should I be treated differently to someone that had cancer? People call up and have cancer, you know, so the invalidation of how difficult it is for you to sit in that queuing system with music and wait, and, you know, so it sometimes makes you not want to divulge those vulnerabilities, because you are often judged for saying, I need this, and the response is, well, why should you get anything different? Because you kind of look the same, or, you know, behave the same. So I've actually been asked to evidence that, you know, when I've said I'm autistic, how do I know you are? And it's like, wow, because I've said that I am, but how do I know that you are? So that actually makes you revert and regress in and say, I'm sharing this, and then it becomes traumatic each time I share it, and I'm getting this judgment and stigma placed on me. One that would work for me is, and it was spoken about at the previous session, quiet space on your own, because that wasn't picked up. And what you see is traditionally quiet areas and schools and places, but they are shared spaces. So for me, and I think a lot of neurodivergent people, you want to be there and decompress on your own in privacy, instead of in front of other people, and other people maybe start to talk, engage, etc., and really raising your arousal levels. Another one I find is, you know, when my sons grew up and I realised that, you know, I would say they had difficulty in queuing situations in relation to their neurodivergence, then it became very apparent it was me that had the difficulties. So again, you know, help and support around if you're going into a busy environment, if it's like a cinema queue, an airline queue. But again, you're still having to evidence why you need to kind of jump that queue, because that kind of anxiety and that kind of shutdown starts to happen for you. And, you know, and on that kind of broader level, accommodations are often controlled by social work if we are kind of asking on that wider level. And the bar can be set very high. And one of those examples is self-directed support, and again on that kind of personal level, receiving support for one of my sons at the moment, there are no adjustments made for me. I'm just treated bog standard, and it's become a traumatic experience that has been severely damaging to my health and well-being.
Thank you, Debbie. Rachel, do you want to come in on this?
I think the biggest change for me has been around accommodating myself in the way that I talk to myself and think about myself, and not blaming myself for not being able to do what other people can do in the ways that they are able to do it. And that's had a really big impact. In terms of university, my accommodations were primarily that the course was designed to be modular and part-time, and I had a support worker funded through the Disabled Students Allowance to support me with planning and organisation and communicating with the course staff. And my tutor also spent additional time with me to make sure that my understanding of the assessment questions was what was intended, and it wasn't me being more literal in understanding the questions. And when topics didn't make sense, they provided explanations to make sure that I fully understood the content rather than saying you need to just accept that's how it is, whereas I needed to understand why it was how it was, and they were able to provide those explanations. I was also given understanding and flexibility around assessment deadlines when other aspects of life contributed to stresses, and that allowed me to avoid more significant burnout. In terms of work, I've been able to accommodate myself primarily by turning to self-employment and designing my job as a wholesale bakery on purpose to minimise interactions and interruptions from customers. Compared to a more traditional bakery setup, we've got more regular orders and more predictability with that kind of setup. But despite accommodating myself, this has only been made possible with my access to work support of 40 hours a week. And that's allowed me to set up and run a multi-award winning social enterprise. So I have support workers with me in person to support me with my executive functioning and communication. And I don't think you can see on the screen, but I have a support worker with me today as well. And it makes such a big difference, particularly around phone calls and ensuring that I'm able to get across what I'm intending to say and minimise the risk of significant misunderstandings and the additional stress that I would then face trying to do that myself in a world which is built for neurotypical communication styles. I've also been able to receive self-directed support at home through social work, and that makes sure that I'm prepared for work and able to manage regular meals and medication, etc.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And KB, you want to come in?
Yeah, a couple of things. The first thing was just to echo how difficult it is to get any kind of reasonable adjustments as an autistic parent or as a neurodivergent parent. It's like the school or someone else might accept that my child needs support and reasonable adjustments, although that's a bit of a nightmare, but they might accept that. But then if I need reasonable adjustments in the way that I communicate with the school or with health or with other people, it's almost like they're like, well, we can't deal with two of you. You know, we're dealing with your child. You can't be as well. You know, like, because I'm a parent, I should be able to just get on with it and just completely dismissed that I might need reasonable adjustments, even tiny ones, like, you know, please don't phone me out of the blue. Could you email me? Which isn't, I don't think, that difficult if it's like a non-emergency. The second thing was we surveyed our members before this, and there were a couple of comments in particular that I wanted to share with you from that survey from two different people. And the first one is, now I have a great job. Reasonable adjustments have been made and continue to be given at the time I need to make changes. I have supportive colleagues who really make an effort to support me in the workplace, encourage me and remind me to reinforce my capableness when I'm not feeling very capable. I have flexible work hours in case I'm having a bad day and struggle to leave my home. So that's a really good, positive one. But the second one is, although my son has a job that he has worked at for over 10 years, now he is still fighting to have the 4 basic reasonable adjustments he asked for adhered to. His managers regularly make nasty comments and behave in a bullying manner towards him in front of other staff. And it's just, I wanted to read those out because they're very different experiences, but that's kind of the core of it. It really depends on your line manager or your colleagues or the teacher or, you know, the police officer that you come across. It's all luck. Whether you manage to talk to the right person who understands and is quite happy to make, you know, reasonable adjustments for you is down to luck, and it shouldn't be down to luck.
Thanks very much for that, KB. And I don't know if you could see, but just as you were speaking, there were a lot of other people around the table nodding. So what you were saying there clearly speaks to other people's experiences as well. I know Leah wants to come in, and then Debbie, I'll come back to you.
Just had 2 points. So one of the things that I found most difficult to argue for in terms of my support was that my support needs to be professional and trained and not just anybody. And that was a big challenge when I was at university because they were always trying to persuade me to take other students. I felt that was grossly inappropriate because they don't have the specialist knowledge to support me, and also they're my peer group. So because my support is also for my physical well-being, that's like a line that isn't I think really should be crossed, and there's a lot of privacy issues for me. So yeah, I felt that was unreasonable. We also, Amaze, surveyed our members before we came to this, and what we had in terms of reasonable adjustments was that 37% of our respondents said that it was extremely hard to get reasonable adjustments. 25% said it was hard, and only 8% said it was actually easy and successful. And I think that's pretty damning in terms of accessibility overall.
Thanks, Leo. Debbie, you wanted to come back?
It was just to add something that, you know, for any of us that are neurodiverse working in third sector, it's something I've been starting to raise with funders because, you know, we have reasonable adjustments which happen across school, college, university. When we are the applicants applying, there have been, you know, great difficulties, time managing, you know, etc. Could there be, you know, could it be looked at that there could be reasonable adjustments made for neurodiverse applicants because our processing is slower, to go back, check. Yesterday I submitted an application and then they had a tech problem, so I shut down the whole day. Couldn't function after that. But, you know, if there was some kind of support similarly to what there is, you know, as you're kind of coming through life, that could be really helpful.
Thanks, Debbie. And Rachel, you wanted to come back in.
Yeah, it was just to echo what Leo was saying. I've also found it incredibly challenging to recruit appropriate support workers, even with my active Access to Work award in place, because the stereotypes of support worker don't include supporting the likes of a CEO setting up a social enterprise. So autism expertise and business expertise weren't expected to be combined. And I think also in terms of access to work and the value of the awards that they make and the rates of pay for the support workers that they're awarding, I don't think it recognises the level of expertise that's so required to support someone to function at that sort of a level. And there's no reason why we shouldn't be expecting to function at that kind of a level either.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to hand back to the convener now to move on, but thank you all for your answers to those.
Yep, we now have questions from Marie McNair, please.
Back to Carolyn. Carolyn, obviously you spoke about medication. What are the issues in terms of accessing medication? I've got kind of examples, you know, from constituents as well, but just want to hear from yourself.
Sure. So I'm on medication right now because I got a private diagnosis. At the time, I thought I'd be able to enter a shared care agreement where the NHS would be able to provide the medication for me based on that private diagnosis. And it's the only reason that I spent the money on the private diagnosis, because I saw that in light of a 17-year wait, I could probably manage the £750. But then they changed the rules in NHS Lothian, and shared care agreements are no longer allowed based on private diagnosis. So my medication is over £100 a month, and earlier, or just last year, I had to stop taking that because I couldn't afford it. And I ended up off work sick within 3 weeks because of burnout, and just was incredibly unwell. I've gone back on it, and I'm basically just putting myself in more debt right now, which I think makes me encouraged to continue to fight to try and rectify the situation within NHS Lothian. And I think, importantly for the remit of this committee, that policy is a failure to uphold the Equality Act. I asked NHS Lothian for details of equality impact assessments, and they confirmed that they hadn't done any. So they've brought in a policy which is restricting access to medication to a group of people who have a disability, and they haven't done a basic equality impact assessment to try and see how that is going to impact people. But like I say, I'm one of the lucky ones, because there are people across the country that can't even get a diagnosis. And so if you can't get a diagnosis, you can't get access to medication. The process of titrating onto medication and getting the right dose is long, it is difficult. My own personal experience is that medication is absolutely life-changing. I've been in better mental health in the last 2 years than in the rest of my life. And depressingly, I'll probably have to stop taking it again quite soon because of the lack of access and the cost of it. it doesn't work for everybody. I know it doesn't, and I can't speak on behalf of everybody with ADHD, but for some people it can be massive. And also the research shows that for people with ADHD, medication can hugely mitigate a lot of the negative outcomes. When we look at levels of suicides, levels of accidental risk, accidental death, the cost on our society as well, the socio-economic impact of this is that you have more people reliant on other services. You look at the number of people in prisons with ADHD, the cost of that is higher than the cost of just actually diagnosing people and giving access to medication. But the medication can mitigate those negative outcomes to a massive degree.
I've had sort of similar examples, through constituents as well, going down the private assessment route and then being refused the medication, the access to medication. Is that the same for kind of everybody else? Is there kind of issues across Scotland? Anybody else want to come in on that one?
So in my particular experience, the medications that were given to me were, one was a stimulant, one was a non-stimulant, and beyond those two particular brands, I was not allowed to try anything else. And so even though they really helped, I didn't huge positive impact on linear thinking and actually doing things in order and managing a household, being the only adult with 3 kids there. It made a huge difference, but it had side effects. And then so when I went back to say, can I try something different? And the policy was, you only try 2, it's basically 2 strikes and you're out and you're discharged and that's you done and you're on your own for it. And it was, I was accused of seeking the diagnosis or seeking support from psychiatrists because I just wanted to get a prescription. So that attitude there is just not on. And I've got another, back to what was just said there, the whole shared care is another problem that we have over here in Forth Valley as well. It's an ongoing cost for people who can afford perhaps the diagnosis, but then keep going back, and then that whole allowing for tweaking, that's just, for some it's okay, and it depends on who the practitioner is, allowing that to and fro and responding to the patient, saying what is it that they need.
And just to clarify, the constituent was that refused access to medication because it was a private diagnosis. So, just to put that on record.
Yes,
I'd like to
Sorry, Helen.
Do you mind if I just come back in on access to medication? Another huge barrier is the stigma around it. There are understandably so many parents who aren't supported to understand what medication is, the impact it has, the side effects, who don't seek a diagnosis often for their children because they don't want to put their children on drugs, because stigma around it has told them that that's what you're doing. You're giving your kids speed, is what I've heard some people say. I've had that said to me, you just want an ADHD diagnosis so you can get amphetamines. So a lot of people are actually put off even accessing the medication because of that kind of societal pressure that you're just drugging your children.
Yeah, I'll leave it there just now.
Oh, sorry, indicated. Yep.
Thanks. I was going to say, I'm still at that stage of awaiting assessment and going back to, the chat about, as he says, assessment important. Of course it is, because how could I possibly access ADHD meds without it? And probably the reason I want to is because I've had lifelong anxiety, like so many other people that have spoke today. Nothing's quite worked. And I have a family member who went on to ADHD meds in adulthood, and their quote was, for the first time in their life, their anxiety melted away. So, I feel that I should have that basic human right to have that, assessment process, and I could probably save the NHS money and say, probably self-diagnose, but to try that medication and see if that actually improves my mental health, which again, reduces cost overall to the NHS.
I mean, medication isn't the answer for everyone. I saw it from a school chum's son, got Ritalin at 6, and life-changing for that boy. Do you know what I mean? He's now in his 20s, but I think it was a different story if he hadn't been able to access that.
Okay, thank you. We now have a question from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for all the information you've provided so far. I've got 2 questions. My first question is around employment, which I know a number of you have touched on in relation to reasonable adjustments. So it's estimated that the employment rate is only 29% for autistic people, and Scotland's national employment rate is 82.5% For non-disabled people, it is 50.7% for disabled people. And looking at these figures, you can see that the employment rate for autistic people is much lower. So I wanted to ask, how can we help autistic people not just enter the workforce, but also to remain in the workforce for the long term? And I know a number of you have mentioned the kind of support you need. I know, Sophia, you touched on some questions as well, the fact that it would be easier to get the questions before and all that. So it'd be good if I can, hear from everybody to see that, what additional things could help you.
Rachel has indicated she'd like to come in.
So, in addition to the autumn employment gap, there's also a pay gap between disabled and non-disabled employees, with autistic employees experiencing the largest pay gap of any disability at 27.9% in 2024. And disabled employees are also more likely to be underemployed and in low-quality jobs. And 47% report lower prospects for career progression, and 13% of disabled workers are self-employed compared to 9% of non-disabled workers. And disabled workers are more likely to be self-employed, often due to the barriers in accessing traditional employment. Employment for disabled people is disproportionately found through self-employment, and there's a need for the entrepreneurial ecosystem that supports this to be more accessible as well. So disability shouldn't be treated like a taboo or a niche that in business support sessions you're told, oh, well, we'll talk about that separately. And the Road to Wonder report, that highlights the value of disabled entrepreneurship and innovation and what we bring to the economy, but it also highlights the need to incorporate well-being into a more holistic approach to entrepreneurial support. And there are definitely great individuals out there who provide fantastic support. However, they're not necessarily representative of the wider organisations that they work for. And with funding for projects being short-term, so is the reporting and therefore the data on the long-term success of these projects, and the interventions is lacking, and the ongoing support is then not available, particularly when it's interventions targeted at underrepresented groups such as women or those with disabilities. The access to work system, which is intended to mitigate the impacts of a person's disability in the workplace, is currently not fit for purpose, with approximately 62,000 individuals still stuck in a backlog waiting for decisions about their award, and awards that are being made are being cut by 40 to 60% if they're not being removed completely at the renewal stage. This results in a lack of support as well as difficulties in accessing the process itself, which has a massive detrimental impact on an individual's ability to engage both in traditional employment and self-employment. Yeah.
Marion has indicated she'd like to come in.
Yeah, I come at this one from a couple of different angles, not only as an autistic person who's had multiple different jobs in different sectors, but I am a former employer who employed purely neurodivergent people when I worked at a charity called Autism Understanding Scotland. We were able to get disability confident leader status whenever I was there, and we worked really hard to do that. And the approach that we always took with our employees there was very, very individual. And what do you need? What works best for you? So, and how can we make that work around your family as well? Because again, I think a lot of people forget that autistic people often have families too, that we often have children who might need a little bit more flexibility. So as somebody who employed autistic people, our unofficial motto was family first. Because if you're worried about your family, then you can't be concentrating on your job. So, making sure that they had that flexibility so that they could do their hours at a time that worked for them, and giving them just lots of understanding and support so that they could work around those needs. and really look after themselves. So if they needed, a mental health day, they could take a mental health day. If they needed a sabbatical, then they had the opportunity to go and take a sabbatical, and their job was still there whenever they came back for them. But having all those things really put in the first place, and whenever we were building the organisation, made it so much easier. And my employees would consistently come and tell me that having a boss who was also autistic, who was also neurodivergent, and who also needed flexibility made the world of difference to them, that it was the most confident that they ever felt being able to go and ask for reasonable adjustments, because they knew that they weren't going to be mocked, they knew that they weren't going to be misunderstood, they knew that they could come and have conversations, they knew that if they started going through perimenopause and they needed something different, they could come and get it. And so there were all sorts of reasons why that made it much more accessible for them. I'm now self-employed, which works out really well for me, and I absolutely love it. But it can also make us incredibly vulnerable. So if you need to take time off because you need surgery and then you need to recover afterwards, then you can't necessarily be accessing the same kind of supports that you would if you were in a larger organisation, but then you don't have all the pitfalls of working for a larger organisation that you might have. So I kind of feel that as a disabled individual, there's no good options that are available. Every option has their pitfalls. And I think it's like KB had mentioned earlier, who you get as a boss can make it, you can be really lucky or you can be really unlucky. You can be working in an organisation for 10 years and have a brilliant experience, and then you get a new line manager and everything changes straight away. So our employment can feel very precarious at times. And whether we're understood or not is a toss of a coin some days, really.
Okay. Debbie?
Thanks. Just a bit of humour here as well. I had that many jobs, like similar to probably most people in career changes, that I thought it was because of my astrological star sign, because I'm a Gemini, before I actually realised I was autistic and things didn't quite fit for me. The ones, the kind of thing that stands out most would be that social anxiety of working in large settings, particularly with lots of females, and managing the dynamics of those relationships. And I used to always feel on the outside looking in. At Differable, we're a very small organisation, and everyone in the team is either neurodivergent or suspects they may be, and or has neurodivergent children. So that enables us to kind of create what everybody needs to make work happen. For many years I was unemployable, and we had a family business, and that's how we would just, kind of wrap it up, unemployable. Other than working for family, because I used to have calls from the school sometimes a dozen times a day from my son. I had to stop work, go and leave. How can you be employed? So back to that, if you are a neurodivergent mother as well, really difficult to maintain employment. If your child stops attending school or part-time attendance, with the EPSNA, how can you work? How can you maintain work? What employer is really going to kind of come forth and offer the adjustments for you? Some may, but it puts, working parents in a really difficult situation. And also fear of disclosure in the workplace for many, it can bring shame. And there's prevalent examples by Autistic Doctors International, which again can lead to, burnout, poor mental health. So I think that the health aspect of managing employment and your neurodivergence and potentially your child's neurodivergence takes a lot of people, to those mini burnouts and to the edge on a very regular basis.
Sophia?
So I'm just looking at responses that we got for our survey as well, because we surveyed out folks in the last week. And we found that 50% of the people who responded said that they felt they were discriminated against at work, and 58% said that they did not feel it safe to disclose that they were neurodivergent. And I've got a couple of responses, actually, if you don't mind. I just want to read out from people that have responded to the survey. I was bullied and pushed out of 2 workplaces by seniors who used my open nature against me. I have since worked for the same place for 4 years now, who have been supportive, and this is more recently, since 2022, when things have been improved, have improved in society, as in the understanding of neurodivergence. Another one was saying about, quite similar to myself, about getting work, but not a secure work, not being able to achieve the threshold for permanent positions in schools, being more vulnerable to racism because of their openness and their demeanour, and the fact that they don't have secure work. It means that they don't have secure housing, and that's an experience I have also myself personally, either if it's private rent or mortgages, because if you don't have the secure income, then people aren't going to help you when it comes to your housing. So it's not just about work or education and family life, but it's also about your housing and finances, not being able to work. Then there's another one who talks about occupational health provider. The person was given assurance that the nurse that they will work with has training in neurodivergence and awareness, but they actually didn't. In fact, they got the impression from the nurse that they're being difficult, and when a nurse recommended support for them, they already tried to explain that these didn't work. They've already tried them, but they were just seen as being quite difficult there. They felt like it was a waste of time, and it was an invasion of the personal life, because things were asked that weren't even related to work, and now they're just having to explore alternative support to employ for the employment. Looking at with myself and my particular characteristics and the people that I support, trying to get support for work is really difficult because of that lack of confidence in asking for help, because you're already looking different and you're already facing that stigma of not having actual representation. So as people have talked about that as well. Having representation at work made it easier if they had that, whether it was work or education settings, because that helped them improve their confidence, find the words, understand what their needs were. But we don't have that representation in the workplace. And then again, back to the whole HR managers, the gaslighting, the amount of gaslighting that happens is incredible. When we ask for reasonable adjustments, it's like, oh, but everyone's a little bit autistic. And that's something I've heard not so long ago by someone who was recently diagnosed, when they had asked for some adjustments. So we get dismissed too quickly, and we're not believed. Everyone finds interviews very difficult, but what they're not understanding is the way we're processing things, and the way, not just the way we're processing and experiencing life, but how people are experiencing us through their own prejudice lens as well, which is then hinders our recruitment and retention, because then that's where we hit the burnout. And it's not that we're not capable, it's about being supported to be able to achieve those capabilities.
Thank you. KB would like to come in on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I was going to say I think we all know, but I don't know. I think the people here who are part of the autistic community all know that school can be and often is extremely traumatic for autistic students and otherwise neurodivergent students. And part of the problem is that there's that built-up trauma and a lot of bad experiences. And then when someone starts work, it can just feel, oh, it's more of the same if they get unlucky and they don't get that good line manager. From our survey again, 92% of people who responded to our survey felt that they had been bullied in the workplace, and 92%, and 75% had been discriminated against. So they're really big numbers, and the misery that can bring, particularly if it's on top of additional trauma that you've already had in your life, experiencing bullying and experiencing discrimination. And also, a lot of autistic people without support are just about managing life. So they're just about scraping through and, you know, maybe struggling day to day. And it's like almost like a full-time job to keep going sometimes. If you don't have that support, that's all you can do. You can't do the work. And for some people who are managing to get into work and are working, I've heard lots of stories, and it's a really common thing to be, well, that's what they do. They do their job. Every evening, they can't do anything. They come home, You know, they keep the lights off. They have to try to like re-regulate. They don't have a social life. They'll go to bed early, and then when it comes to the weekend, they're not going out or doing anything. Again, that's rest time. So all they're doing is going to work, coming home, going to bed, maybe being able to eat something. Or maybe not being able to eat something. It's really, really, really hard. So the solutions aren't just about support in the workplace, although obviously we do need flexibility and support and employers who understand that to get the best out of their employees, you know, small adjustments can make a huge change for people. But we also need to recognise that if someone's working, it isn't just support in the workplace, it's probably support at home too, because without the support at home, they can't manage the job. So it's looking at someone as a whole person, and that goes back to the difficulty again about like getting that support, and particularly the times that when people most need the support are probably the times when they will find it even more difficult to make the phone calls and fill in the forms and do all of the things to get the support. So if they don't have the support to get the support, they can just end up with nothing. I know, like, yeah, I can see Marion laughing, but of recognition, I think. You really,
it's true.
you need support to get support. It's the same as getting disabled students allowance. You don't get any support to get that. The support comes if you manage to fill in the forms and get the allowance. But the support to actually get support is a huge gap, I feel.
Carolyn and Rachel have indicated they'd like to come in on this point. Sorry, and Leo.
Thanks. You were talking about employment rates and essentially what was hindering employment rates. And having worked for both small outfits and multinational corporations at different levels, what I have noticed is, and obviously more so recently, is the use of screening software basically is built to essentially spot neurotypical candidates. And so we're not even getting through those initial screens where there isn't even any human doing the initial sift. So the issue with employment is completely across the whole system, from even if you've managed to get the support or not to apply for something, you're already on the back foot, whether you disclose or not. I personally have found that I've only had one employer where I disclosed and it was okay. Every single other one found it quite difficult to wrap their head around. Also, to touch on Rachel's point about the effect of the withdrawal of support, I had a couple of years ago a very nice job with a international bank, and I lost that because through no fault of my own, my support was withdrawn. And then my contract was not renewed because I literally couldn't turn up to work because I didn't have the support to get to work. So those are really common issues, but I would go back to it's not once we're in work, it's literally getting into work. And quite often, even during the application process, if we're asking for reasonable adjustments, not only is the onus quite frequently put on us to try and somehow miraculously work out beforehand what adjustments we're going to need when we don't necessarily know what format the interview and assessments are going to take place, but also the ones we're quite often offered are just from a list and really basic, and the one I'm frequently offered is more time. I don't need more time to do assessments. What I need is people to understand how to phrase the questions and also to understand my response is going to be different because literally my thinking is structured differently, and that can be really hard to get around. So, yeah, thank you.
Caroline, please.
Thanks. I think your question was specifically about autistic people, but I think for all neurodevelopmental conditions, as we've heard, it's not just unemployment, it's an issue, it's also underemployment. Personally, people would say that I'm in a successful career now. I certainly wasn't for a very long time, and I still feel like a failure. I feel like I failed to achieve what I could have achieved. And a lot of studies on people with ADHD show that they're more likely to be unemployed, they're more likely to struggle with work performance, demonstrate difficulty in maintaining job stability, attaining any higher job status and therefore face more financial hardships. And a lot of this stems from the symptoms of ADHD also impacting on education, because people with ADHD are more likely to be undereducated relative to their intellectual ability than those without ADHD. We need ADHD-aware workplaces, we need autism-aware workplaces, because a lot of the symptoms of ADHD will stop people asking for help. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria has forced me in the past to leave good jobs instead of seeking the help that I needed to actually thrive there, where I could have actually succeeded in the role had I myself had an awareness of what to ask for, and if my employers had had an awareness of what support would help me. So I think that a lot of it stems from, yes, tackling the issues within the education system, but we need that kind of, again, an awareness within workplaces of what might help, and not always relying on the individual to be the one to dictate exactly what support they need, but realising that ADHD awareness and neurodiversity awareness in general could create more inclusive workplaces for everybody.
Thank you. Before we just go on to Rachel, who'd like to come in on this, would you be comfortable explaining what rejection-sensitive dysphoria is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, reaction sensitivity dysphoria is not actually a diagnostic criteria of ADHD, but it's an incredibly commonly held symptom that goes along with it. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist. It basically is a fear of being rejected that occurs before you're rejected. So it's that I don't like to ask anybody for help. This is something I've been working on myself, because I will not ask for help because I don't want to be a burden, and I have that fear that somebody might say no to me. And to me, like, I think that I'm ridiculous for having that. It's so irrational. It stops me sending emails, sending text messages, because I'm scared of rejection. And I don't actually, when rejection happens, I'm capable of responding well to it. But it's a fear of the rejection before it even occurs. And when I express this to people, that I was scared that they might get annoyed or bothered by me or reject me, they think I'm, of course they wouldn't. They think that's completely ill-held kind of thought to have, and a wrong thought to have. But I can't help it. It's just completely built within me that there are days where I cannot even send an email because I just will stare at a screen and be completely incapable of hitting the button out of that utter fear of rejection.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Rachel, please.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with the level of intersecting factors that are involved in being able to maintain employment. Through the Neurodivergent Entrepreneurs Network, we brought together the voices of many neurodivergent entrepreneurs in the We Speak Tangent podcast, which is still available on Spotify. These discussions highlighted that there are so many themes that intersect in their ability to work, and that makes them very relevant to this inquiry. And it would be remiss in any discussion not to be including the intersectional factors and discrimination in employment, such as an example that was highlighted in the report Excluded by Design, Research on Disabled Women's Employment in Scotland, which details the impacts of sexual violence on the employment of neurodivergent women. This impacts not only through time off work for related appointments and distress, but also through company attitudes, with those who reported their experiences to their work, reporting that 62% of them subsequently had their performance questioned at work. In addition to our own discussions, we reference that research above and further research in 2024 that presents data suggesting that these experiences of sexual violence are disproportionately higher for autistic women, with 9 out of 10 autistic women experiencing sexual violence in their lifetime, and 7 out of 10 experiencing this from multiple perpetrators. So solutions to neurodivergent employment need to be holistic and reflect the lived experiences of neurodivergent people, in addition to being trauma-informed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I've got one more question, but this probably question is more directed at Sophia. I did mention it when she came in, but I'm quite open if anybody else wants to come in on this question as well. The National Autistic Society has conducted research on why a large number of BAME autistic people are not getting the support they need. One of the observations was that disability can be stigmatised in certain communities and sometimes blamed on the parents. It was also interesting to hear that some families said they initially refused to acknowledge that their child was autistic. So how can we ensure that BAME neurodivergent people get the support they need? Sophia, I know we touched on this.
It's quite a big question there. It's a societal shift again, and it's about don't want to be a burden. What was just said, and I just wrote that down because that whole concept of not asking for support and not being a burden is quite high in migrant families and racialised people because of the way we're treated in the system. Then there's that whole not looking different, because bodies look different, but it's that taboo of disability in itself, because for us to have any value, because we already have less value because we look different, if we have a disability additional to that, then we also then have less human value, and that's how we're treated by the system, which then festers in this internalised ableism that we have huge amounts of in our different communities. We still have this belief that autism was caused by vaccines, even right now, bad parenting. Autism is only talked about here in this country. There's no such thing back home. We have these kind of concepts because it is talked about more openly here and we don't have the language for it back home, or it's because we've spent the past 50 years just trying to integrate in this society. We haven't even given importance to our own mental health, our own well-being, our own accommodations that are required. A lot of migrant communities are actually self-employed, depending on sector, because they can't get employment because of different reasons. And there is that hidden intersectionality. Is it because of the racism or a disability? And so they're in their own communities. And so when you're in your own community, you can't say anything different. And it's that lack of awareness and talking to people. There's also a lot of isolation as well, so people who will have difficulties trying to get support for their children. And I've heard of even very highly educated people, doctors, psychiatrists, who will have children who are neurodivergent, who refuse to accept it because of the taboo, because of the stigma around it. What we try to do here at CIMA is trying to demystify what autism is, what ADHD is. A lot of it is there's no understanding. No, there's a conflation between learning disabilities and autism and what being autistic is like. And so, like for example, I was at the mosque other night there, and there was an autistic boy sitting next to me, and there was me, and there was him. He had learning disabilities, and obviously and I don't. But I felt connected with him, but I would get judged very differently when I'm saying that I'm autistic and I need support. The first thing that I always get told is, but you speak so well. And it's that lack of understanding. So we need a lot of community training. We have started that over a small project that we're doing. And I get told, an interesting one is, because I've grown up, born and brought up in Falkirk, and in that community, I have a certain kind of reputation here. And I was, after giving a talk about autism and understanding it, a lady came up to me saying two things that were very stark. One was, I helped her understand her own child and how he reacts to things. Because they were trying to explain it away with different ideas and different labels, and trying to just get him to conform, because conformity and hierarchy is a big thing in different cultures. But then she also says, now I understand you, because I thought you weren't very sociable because you just don't like our community. And that was quite a funny one, because I've been rejected by my own community because I'm autistic, but then I'm also rejected by the neurotypical community at large. So it's like me trying to find my space has been very, very difficult, and therefore I retreated quite a bit. So if we had more of an anti-racist approach in all our services, for example, given reasonable supports for children, a white autistic ADHD child compared to a brown one, if it was less difficult for the brown parent, they would probably find that much more easier to go for it because of the stress and strains of their life as it is without being disabled. That's a living reality of our world here in Scotland, and I think we need to kind of fess up to it, that the discrimination is everywhere. Like one of the people said in my interview there, they feel that they're more vulnerable to racism because they're autistic and ADHD. Certainly that's been my experience as well. I'm also self-employed because the schools where I live are too unwilling to make changes with their ethos and policies, and the managers just don't want the headache of addressing racism or addressing ableism that they have. So therefore those experiences, they make you just be a wee hermit and just not want to come out at all. And we still have this, back to the social work, SDS, not being able to have the access, the form filling, the language, to get that support, don't know what's available, so they're struggling, so they don't leave the house. We have people that I know who will not tell other folks in the community that they have an autistic child because of the shame They just don't mention it. The kid doesn't quite leave the house. We have the culturally insensitive care when it comes to SDS. So who's going to come and look after the child? You know, people would want to have family members who understand their culture, their religion, their food, clothes, but then they're like, no, you have to have from a certain agency a certain amount of money. It's not culturally sensitive at all, the support or the care either. So it's that negativity, and then also the fact that we're hidden away, so we won't have those children coming out in community spaces because the parents are so burnt out trying to get support. And then when it comes to the adults as well, like KB said, autistic adults, autistic children, they also will not leave the home and integrate with their community because of the stigma there. So we have to have our voices heard, not just within our communities and readdressing and re-educating our own communities. It needs to be the outside who need to support them. And this is probably a good point of me saying for the committee as well to come onto our website. We've got under our projects webpage, there's a project that we had done listening to lived experiences of autistic people in Scotland from racialised backgrounds on a topic of education, work and womanhood and transitions. 3 extensive books collecting quotes directly from folks telling us about the experience of different aspects of the topics there, which I think the committee will find really insightful to understand what we are experiencing within our own community, the stigma, but also from the outside as well.
Sorry, can I just come back, Convener Sophia? It's really good to, you know, well, it's terrible that the community is going through that, but it's good to hear exactly what you're speaking about. Now, I've spoke to, I said to you earlier on, I spoke to some families that have children, autistic children, and there's reasons beyond racism and discrimination that they don't want to face up their child has autism. Obviously, in a lot of cultural settings later on, especially with arranged marriages and the kind of cultures, relationships, that they putting a label on a child so young, and then growing up and knowing this person is autistic, and you know, unfortunately, they'll name it more than just autistic. They'll say a lot more to it, and then that child's prospects have suddenly gone. Never mind us talking about today education and jobs, but actually the marriage prospect, the relationships, the cultural aspect, all disappears. So it's actually quite cultural in communities, especially with ethnic backgrounds. So what's your view on what can be done differently? Because people would rather say that their child is behaving badly or differently, but not say that child has a disability or is autistic or needs help.
It's back to the labelling stigma. We have carers of young adults as well who are worried about their kids not getting employment or not getting married. I've spoken to those parents, and I've actually spoken to those lovely young people as well. And it's that mindset of school, university, job, marriage, and that is your life already planned out for you. And you have to be a doctor or an engineer, which is, being an engineer is all right if you're autistic. My oldest is also doing engineering. He's very stereotypically autistic, his kid. But for him to have a marriage is something we always talk about, is relationships and how to support him in his relationships. What we're not understanding is for him to live a fulfilling life, doesn't have to be a very set route. It doesn't have to be that you're married by 25, otherwise, you know, you failed. Because that's the kind of pressures that we have in our communities. It's back to community training, back to going to and we do have our places of worship, and we have ethnic minority different groups. We have, I know, the Kenyan Society, the Latin American one, we've got Sahelia, we've got loads of different community groups that can be worked with, who work with ethnic minorities, who have an influence in their areas, who then need to be trained up. And if they start talking about things more openly, I think we could challenge that, because that's something that I do as well. I go into these groups and I do challenge it, and I do get a lot of fight back as well. Like, this was not something that happened in our day. It's something that I've heard quite a lot recently when I've been out in the communities as well. It's not for us, this kind of thing. And it's because of environment. So one thing, interesting thing was, back home, the same person was fine, and then they migrated to Scotland, and now they're having all the issues. Like, the environment changed, and I could say the same thing for me. When I worked in London, I would never have known I was autistic until I came back to Scotland, and I faced multiple levels of discrimination. But I wouldn't have known had I continued working in London. So my environment changed, and the challenges changed. The way people treated me changed, and therefore all of a sudden I became autistic at 30. No, I didn't. I always was. My environment had changed, and to understand that our environments are not natural to us as people who need more vitamin D, more iron, more rest, more socialising, who have a certain, like, our generational trauma that we're bringing to the table. Let's talk about that too. We're bringing all this complex human experiences, and it gets mushed up, and then we do have that barrier to understanding ourselves. Like I said, we're just being too caught up. Why did it take till 2023 for an organisation like SEMA to exist? It was because the support wasn't there. That's why I had to do it. It was being pushed back by psychiatrists, doctors, employers, housing, social work, police, justice, all of it being pushed back every way. That's when we realised that actually we're really late to the table, whereas we've had people like Amaze and ARG who have talked about autistic rights. We don't even know our rights as humans, let alone as autistic people over here. We're being discriminated, and it has to be because of the fact that we, especially in today's day, we get told to get back home. I had that when I was a kid. I had that this year. I've had that last year. We're getting told to get kicked out if we don't behave. So this is even more of a hindrance for us to ask for support or be confident in understanding ourselves.
Thank you very much for sharing so much, especially your experience as well. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. We now have a question from Paul McLennan, please. Oh, apologies. Debbie, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it was just very quickly. That's okay.
Yeah.
Just following on, you know, obviously the cultural barrier, we do get a lot of families directed to us from CAMS, social work, we're kind of based in Glasgow, Greater Glasgow area, and we're lucky one of our colleagues speaks fluent Punjabi or doing some Hindi and can help, you know, build up that kind of safe space and help with some of the cultural difference. But we see the language barrier huge because we offer quite a wide programme of accessing information, training and support. But as a third sector organisation, we have no budget for interpreters. So more often than not, people end up locked out of, you know, gaining that information and knowledge around their own neurodivergence or that of their child, because of language. So again, you know, if there was some support like the Health and Social Care Partnership, if there was a way of kind of getting access to the interpreters, we would be able to give a lot more support, you know, and but the language can be that number one barrier, you know, when people are coming, you know, to seek support from us.
Thank you. Paul, please.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. We had our College of Psychiatrists in just before you came in, and I suppose there was a couple of key things, and I remember meeting with him, and one of the things he talked about was it's a cross-agency approach, and all the evidence we've heard this morning, it's very much, there's not one single solution. I suppose there are a couple of key questions for me. One was around about, you talked about awareness in workplaces, and I think that's incredibly important, and I think that can be very mixed. Is there legislation required around about that? Is guidelines going to be enough? Is legislation required to do that? Because we have legislation on various other issues that employers should be picking up, I suppose, is one question. I suppose the second thing in terms of that is, I suppose when it comes into the broader issues around about, I think you just mentioned about the Health and Social Care Partnership. I know we talked about shared care, but the Health and Social Care Partnership, for example, education is a key issue as well. And we're hearing obviously some of your diagnosis when you were in your 20s, 30s and so on. There's kids obviously getting diagnosed earlier, so there more needs to be done around about education. And I do some work with an organisation called Stand, who obviously some of you may know about. And so they talk around about the awareness in schools, and the schools issue can be very mixed. It depends very much on teachers' awareness. You can have one teacher in the school who's very good, you have another teacher in another classroom who doesn't understand the issues around about it. So I suppose it's talking around about that shared agency kind of work, and it's very mixed. And I think it very much depends on who your employer is, what your school is, and who your GP is. And we could be picking this up, and it could improve it for some people, but not for others. So do we need legislation as well as investment into services and so on? And I think that's one of the key things, I think, for me. So, Leo, I see you with your hand up there. I'll come to yourself first.
Yeah. So I have, as I said earlier, I had difficult experiences with employers, and twice I have sued employers successfully as a result. Do I think we need more legislation that's directly to do with employment? Yes, I do, but it's more to do with the systems of employment. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the use of automated sifting systems that aren't designed for neurodivergent people. So there's no regulation of that. So that is definitely an area. There's no regulation of machine learning pretty much anyway. So I would challenge that, especially as we see machine learning entering more and more aspects of our life, including education. So that would concern me. I would also challenge in terms of the workplace and legislation. The legislation exists, but there's not much knowledge about the legislation. There's not much knowledge of our rights. Amaze, all of us here, in fact, all the organisations here, one of our main purposes is to let our members know about what their rights are. And that falls upon us as members of the third sector, and really maybe it should fall upon wider government and be something in education that we teach all children. What are their rights? How do they fulfil those rights? How do they recognise when those rights are not there and not present? So that would be my question. Can you legislate for that? To some extent, yes. And legislation that serves a useful purpose in terms of helping to push forward societal change. We can see that with things as simple as marriage equality, smoking, all those things. Decisions were made in the legislature that were ahead of thinking, and they have then pushed thinking forward in a progressive manner. So, yeah, there's room for legislation, but it has to be the right legislation, and it has to involve those of us with lived experience in it at every stage, or frankly, it won't work.
I think that's a really important point, because last week we were talking about the public sector equality duty, which is really a duty on those in the public sector to make sure there's equality through all the systems. This is one area that I don't think has had a focus in terms of this, and we heard figures from saying to 10 to 20% of the population are neurodivergent. So I mean, that's a huge element of people we're talking about. So there is maybe that influence in terms of how we can embed what we're talking about, either it's in legislation or in that public sector equality duty right across. And I think that's maybe a consideration certainly for me to discuss when we talk about this in more detail.
I would also point to, in terms of, so I have one of my qualifications is also a law qualification. I would also question one of the issues that we face as disabled people generally is that thanks to what scholars would view as bad decisions in the High Court, we face a very uphill battle because there has been placed a preponderance of the requirement to fulfil financial decisions taking precedence over other human rights. And I think if you were thinking about legislation, that would be something legislation would have to challenge. In terms of the public sector duty requirement, in my experience, it's that quite often organisations don't understand what it actually means in practice on the ground, including local authorities, especially at the front line. People who are working in the front line don't understand that there is a duty placed upon them to take into account disabled people's requirements and their rights, and so those often get ignored as a result.
And I think you're spot on, because I think we heard colleagues saying that. I mean, you can go to a school, or you can go into GPs. There'll be some that are well aware of that. There are some that just aren't. So that's a real issue. But no, thank you for that. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in. Caroline? Yeah.
It's just Marion has indicated that she would like to come in on that point, but just I don't want to stifle the conversation. It's been really interesting, really insightful. but unfortunately we do have to keep to time. Is one of those things that we have to be cognizant of. So we have about, I would say, about 7 or 8 minutes left, and still a little bit to go over. So if we could keep questions and answers as succinct as possible, so we can get through as much as possible.
Can I bring in Marion and then Caroline after that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Marion?
I'll try and be fast. I'm a former teacher and a parent, and I've delivered training to, I think, all but 2 of the schools in Aberdeen City. So getting the training absolutely right is essential, because if we have the wrong people who are delivering training, then it makes things so much worse. So it's not just about, do we mandate training, do we legislate for it, do we make sure that this is part of how we do it. We have to really think about who's the right people to be delivering that, who are the right people to be developing that, and my argument would always be that we need autistic professionals to be delivering autism training. We need neurodivergent professionals to be delivering ND training, because I've been brought into so many different organisations, schools, businesses, charities, all sorts of places, because they've had really poor quality training from what people would have expected to be good organisations, that I've then had to work really hard to undo what they've learned before I can then help them to actually learn what's really going to help us in the first place. And the last wee quick point that I'll make is that all the schools that I've worked with, every single one of them has known about the UN CRPD, which is brilliant. Most of them have got posters up on the walls about it. I have never once spoken to a teacher, ever, who has heard of the UN CRPD, the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, until I bring it up. So we need much more recognition of that, because if we want our children's rights to be met, then we need all of their rights to be met, not just their rights because they're children, but their rights for being disabled children as well.
Okay. Caroline and then Rachel.
Yeah, I agree entirely with Marion, and with what Leo was also saying about the public sector equality duty and equality impact assessments. In terms of legislation, the legislation that's really needed is the incorporation of all of our rights into law. I know that bill has been kicked down the road, but that would give us the right to education, it would give us the right to work, it would give us the right to health, it would give us access to justice when those rights are not being met, and they're not being met right now. None of those rights are being met for people with ADHD. My only concern around that is the right to life isn't being met either for people with ADHD. You've got a condition causing a 6 to 13 year reduction in life expectancy, and it's not being met. So, we do need legislation. We need all of our rights to be available to us. We need to be able to gain kind of access to justice when those rights are not met. But we need to make sure that there's actually an easy access to justice provided as well.
Rachel and then Debbie.
So we believe that broader social change is required to ensure that current and any future legislation is accessible to those who benefit from it and is implemented to its intention, and not ignored or implemented only once it's forced through legal action or as the very bare minimum. And connected to this, we are aware that in addition to a generalised reluctance to report abuse, this is exacerbated where our members have previous involvement with police, particularly where there have been inappropriate responses to being overwhelmed or experiencing a mental health crisis, which have not recognised or accommodated the needs of an autistic individual. There's also significant challenges around engagement with the police, with such a heavy reliance on the use of phone calls to 101, social work and the police themselves in order to report experiences of abuse or concerns for another person's safety or well-being, and that this is especially the case in rural areas where police stations are not staffed full-time. In the 2021 study, Anything But the Phone Communication Mode Preferences in the Autism Community, it highlights that reliance on communication via phone calls creates barriers and highlights the need for services to move away from a reliance on phone calls for communication, and that they should make sure that access to support is not dependent on the phone, and recommend that they offer written options such as email and live messaging, which are more accessible to many neurodivergent individuals. And this is especially true for those individuals for whom using the phone is not only challenging but completely inaccessible. As mentioned, all of this is then exacerbated in rural areas where in-person options, if they are present, are then inaccessible due to things like travel costs. So these are things that should be covered by existing legislation, but it's not being implemented in a way that is accessible and working to protect the people that it's there to protect.
Thank you. Debbie, please.
Thank you. In relation to the training, I think we always have to be careful that one person's experience of autism or ADHD or dyslexia or dyspraxia is one person's. At recent training we done with University of Glasgow, it was highlighted that it would be unlikely to have less than 3 neurodivergencies. You know, that would be kind of minimum. So most people will not be picked up. They'll be picked up for one condition. So I think it's, you know, applying that full spectrum of neurodivergence from experience rather than specific, because you are most likely to have other neurodivergence that has not been formally diagnosed. And again, thinking of those who are not yet diagnosed and who may never will be, that potentially are parents, and bringing their lived experience of that journey of neurodivergence and the impact on the whole family unit. And that has, you know, we think, a place in how to kind of move forward. And it's quite often from a different angle, you know, from your child, but you are seeing it from a different perspective as well. And we think there's validity, you know, in making sure that parents also would be included in moving forwards.
Thank you. That's it. KB would like to come in.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to say something about training. I agree with what Marion said. It's our experience too that we've gone into places and they've said that what they've had previously wasn't that helpful. I would also say that we need people with lived experience, but also, you know, additional professional experience as well, to be writing and delivering the training. And also, I think part of the problem is that there aren't national standards. So I'm a big fan of like core capability, some sort of core capability framework that actually sets out what people should know and how that should be delivered. Not training written by government, but a framework written by government, and written by government with the input and led by people with lived experience, those people, the same kind of people who would be delivering the training. And not focused on PBS, because I think that's a big problem at the moment, that a lot of training seems to push PBS as being the answer to everything, when it really isn't. I mean, we'd like to see a ban, and I think a lot of other disabled people's organisations would too. And there was one last thing that I wanted to add, but I forgot because I got distracted by PBS. Oh, and yeah, also there seems to be a lot of time spent talking about restraint and seclusion, and time put into training around that, when there isn't really that depth of training to the same level being put into how do neurodivergent people think, how do we support them in a practical way. So not the theoretical stuff, the real practical stuff that might reduce the need for restraint and seclusion. So not focusing on that, but focusing on how to make, I suppose we're mainly talking about schools, how to make the school environment supportive in a way that protects everyone against things going horribly wrong and inappropriate restraint, or even what some might think would be appropriate. Sorry, I will stop talking because I know we've been told we don't have much time.
Yes, thank you. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we are really coming down to the last bit here, but I really don't want to stifle this discussion we've been having. But in the remaining time that we have, which is just a couple of minutes, are there any points that any of our witnesses would like to get across before we close? But if we could make it as succinct as possible, please. Thank you. Leo, and then Debbie.
Thanks.
And then Rachel.
So one of the themes we were told you might have time to talk about was the criminal justice system. So in order to keep it succinct, I did have an example of a systemic failure all the way through, but I will not go into that. So in our survey of our respondents before I came here, only 10% felt that the criminal justice system was in any way accessible, even partially accessible. And 80% felt that when they had to interact with the criminal justice system in any fashion, they had felt both misunderstood, their needs weren't met, and they were discriminated against. And I think those are really, quite frankly, appalling figures. And they're pretty consistent across all of those that did surveys of our membership. So.
Thank you. Debbie?
Yeah, just a phrase that hasn't been used today, sensory processing difference. You know, we think it's really important that there is that understanding and acknowledgement of the sensory difference of majority of neurodivergent people. It is kind of tagged more to autism. But, you know, really important to understand that and kind of moving forwards, because it's not just about the lights and the sounds, but the sensory environment is something, you know, particularly within, you know, we were talking a lot about work, but it could be hit or miss in an employment environment, is really people understanding how that impacts neurodivergent people.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Rachel and then Marion.
We believe that at the moment, the biggest difference to support autistic people in Scotland across all areas, including education, employment and criminal justice, would come from strong, sustainable, autonomous and appropriately funded APOs, autistic people's organisations. The often life-changing impact of finding your own community and the value of peer support networks appears to be underrated by decision makers at the moment. A move to ensuring that APOs, autistic people organisations, are strong, sustainable, autonomous and appropriately funded would make these benefits more readily available without coming at the mental and financial cost of those involved in running them, as is often the current experience, with limited support available and such uncertainty about the continuity of funding, if it can be secured at all. A shared community has incredible value for our quality of life in and of itself, as has been described in the 2025 study, A Certain Magic, Autistic Adults' Experiences of Interacting with Other Autistic People in Relation to Quality of Life. However, it would also allow autistic people to engage more effectively with broader societal and decision-making processes, ensuring that work to target issues that are disproportionately affecting autistic people is efficient, meaningful, and above all, autistic-led.
Marion, please.
Thank you so much for having us along today. I think I want to echo Rachel's point about the need for good, sustainable funding for autistic disabled people's organisations. As somebody who used to run one that had to close down because of lack of funding, I can't overstress how important that is. But I really want to finish by supporting what KB was saying about the need to ban PBS and ABA. That does so much to traumatise our society, and it is something to traumatise our community, and it's something that can be done. It's something that should be done. It's very, very overdue, and I think that's one of the most important things that could be considered in party manifestos that are coming out, and future actions and considerations for the committee going forward.
Thank you. And Sophia, you've indicated, and Caroline.
Go back to the whole importance of the diagnosis and look at the criminal justice system. Someone had mentioned that ADHDers are overrepresented in the criminal justice system there. I want to give an example of a case I had supported well last year, in fact. The fact that this person did have a diagnosis, had to come to court for an alleged hurting somebody, and it was an abuser. So this person is very vulnerable, was abused, but then they hit back, and then they're the ones going to court. Their diagnosis is what saved them. They got an absolute discharge, and without that, they would have been prosecuted very, very differently. But that understanding and that solid piece of paper from the NHS made all the difference for that person then being able to go on with life and doing what they need to do, rather than being charged and being sent in prison for it, or other consequences for what they had done. Because then, even though the understanding of that person, where they got to, how they got in front of the court, wasn't there's no time for that. The importance of the diagnosis, it helps explain not us to ourselves, but also everyone, our family, our friends, our work, our education. Everything is explained, because we then have an openness of wanting to understand the language and the experiences of being autistic. And also back to the criminal justice part is one thing that is real weird and failing is the need for AAC, alternative augmentative communication. We're talking about the police, the access in the police, but then also accessing the court system, giving statements and evidence. The procurator fiscal, I think, need to do a lot of training and understanding that people who speak at some points does not mean that they can speak at all points, and the impact of emotional dysregulation has on people's ability, and that could be for trauma, sensory, communication differences, for whatever reason that they're there. But the whole training and the rights of accessibility is much broader than what we understand right now. So AAC really needs to be put into consideration for all aspects of life.
Thank you. And Carolyn, and then we'll end there.
Yeah, we desperately need a nationwide strategy for pathways to assessment and support. Right now, it's a postcode lottery, and that needs to come from the government. I mean, the Human Rights Act says that governments must take reasonable steps to prevent avoidable deaths, such as by addressing systemic failings in healthcare, and ADHD is causing avoidable deaths across Scotland. We need standardised referral criteria and triaging tools and national targets for wait times. And this redesigning a referral system doesn't need to cost a huge amount of money. It needs to be a coherent approach rather than a huge investment. But it also makes socio-economic sense. The cost of untreated ADHD is costing us a fortune. It's estimated that over the next 10 years, undiagnosed ADHD could have a total economic cost of between 6.5 billion to 11.2 billion across the UK. That is in our prison systems, that's in our health systems, in our education systems. It's higher rates of accident and emergency admissions because of being prone to accidental injury. So it would cost a lot less to just give us a better access to diagnosis.
Thank you. And on that note, I just want to thank everybody so much for joining us today. It has been an incredibly helpful session, and the invitation is there that after this meeting, if things come to your mind, things you wish you'd said, or other contributions that you would wish to make, that the door is not closed after this session. Please feel free